Previously, in the North African Campaign series, we've seen the Italians advance into Egypt, only to be thrown back during Operation Compass, Britain's greatest forgotten victory of the war, which saw the British reach the El Agheila area. Rommel then landed in Africa and launched his first offensive, driving the British back to Tobruk and the Egyptian frontier. Failing to take Tobruk, Rommel resisted the British offensives of Operations Brevity and Battle Axe, but was driven back during Operation Crusader, which has to be the most insane battle ever, and subsequently he fell back to El Agheila again. Then Rommel launched his second offensive, forcing the British back to the Gazala line, which is where we are now. In the aftermath of Rommel's second offensive in Libya, the British had entrenched at the Gazala line, 30 miles west of the port of Tobruk. From these positions, the commander of the British 8th Army, General Ritchie, was ordered to launch a fresh offensive to the west. Ritchie's boss, General Auchinleck, Chief of the Middle East, was keen to attack, because somebody was breathing down his neck. That somebody was Prime Minister Churchill, who was as impatient as ever, demanding numerous times between February and June 1942 that Auchinleck attack. To be as fair as possible, there were various political pressures on Churchill, and he really needed a victory. The British had just lost Singapore, perhaps the worst defeat in British military history. A good chunk of Burma and the East Indies had been taken by the Japanese, Malta was under a heavy siege, and the Germans had just succeeded in sending 3 of their ships straight through the English Channel. While Churchill had won a vote of confidence in January 1942, morale at home was low, and so the political pressure was on Churchill to gain some sort of victory. Auchinleck, though, resisted committing to a premature offensive. He told Churchill that it wasn't possible to attack until June. Churchill damned Auchinleck's unwillingness to attack, and even the Defence Committee sided with Churchill, who then ordered Auchinleck to come to London for a consultation. But surprisingly, Auchinleck refused this order, and Churchill contemplated removing Auchinleck from command. Instead, he sent Sir Stafford Cripps and Lieutenant General Archie Nye to Auchinleck to present his case. And they both ended up siding with Auchinleck and then produced a detailed report that ruled out the possibility of an attack. Needless to say, Churchill was not amused. The argument continued right through until May, which was when Churchill said that if an attack on Malta happened, Auchinleck would be ordered to launch an immediate offensive to distract the Germans. And he even sent a telegram to Auchinleck that gave him the choice of complying or resigning. Ultimately, Auchinleck committed to a limited offensive in June, which would put him in a strange position when the British Ultra-Intelligence Service deciphered the German Enigma codes and told Auchinleck that Rommel was about to attack him. Ultra was not able to inform Auchinleck of Rommel's tactics for the upcoming offensive, so he had to guess what his intentions were. But it was obvious that Rommel would want to take the port of Tobruk, and what's going to become important later in the video is that Auchinleck told Ritchie to prevent Tobruk from being taken, because if the Axis took it, this would shorten their supply lines, allowing them to advance into Egypt. Ritchie was not to defend Tobruk itself if the Axis broke through the Gazala line, he would abandon it, but he was to destroy the port to prevent its use as a logistics base. Locking up an entire division in the port, as they had done previously, and then struggling to resupply it via sea just wasn't appealing. A long line of minefields was therefore laid, and this stretched down the coast to the position of Bir Hakeim. They could have made it shorter, but the British believed that a long line would make Rommel think twice before going around the south due to his overstretched logistics and limited fuel supplies. The British infantry under General Gott's 13th Corps therefore positioned themselves along this line and at Tobruk. But because this line was long, there simply weren't enough troops to man the entire length of it, and the British were stretched thin. Each brigade was in a separate defensive box, and there were gaps between them. So, to compensate for this, several fortified positions were created behind the lines to block roads and generally prevent free movement in the event Rommel did go around the flank. This has actually caused a long-running debate amongst historians over whether this plan of having a line running through the desert was a good thing or not. But the overall point is that the British positions were somewhat isolated from each other and the flank was still exposed. After assessing the situation, Auchinleck told Ritchie that he thought Rommel had two options. He could either try to go around the southern flank and aim for Tobruk, or he could simply break through the centre of the line. Auchinleck believed that Rommel would strike the line itself, while a feint would be made in the south to draw the British armour away. Auchinleck concluded this because the panzer divisions were near the coast, so it made sense that Rommel would attack the Gazala line head-on rather than go all the way round the south. However, Rommel had this habit of doing the unexpected, and so Auchinleck wasn't entirely certain what the Desert Fox would do, and decided to play it safe. He ordered Ritchie to place the British armour under General Norrie's 30 Corps west of El Adam, where they could be used to stop an attack from the centre or the south, depending on what Rommel did. Well, Ritchie disagreed with Auchinleck, thinking that Rommel's main thrust would strike around his flank. So Ritchie decided to place his two armoured divisions much further to the south than Auchinleck had wanted. This wasn't a bad idea in and of itself, but Ritchie made the mistake of splitting the two armoured divisions apart from one another. He thought that if Rommel came around Bir Hakeim, 7th Armoured Division could delay him and fall back, giving plenty of time for the 1st Armoured Division to come up and join the battle. This was great in theory, but would it work in practice? Interestingly, the two corps commanders disagreed with Ritchie. They respected Auchinleck more than the inexperienced Ritchie and shared Auchinleck's opinion that Gott's infantry would take the brunt of the attack. So the more experienced commanders believed Rommel would just attack the line, whereas the least experienced commander thought that Rommel would go south. We'll see shortly who was right. Ritchie may have been a good staff officer, and his appointment to 8th Army's command during Operation Crusader may have been necessary. But he was inexperienced and had only ever commanded a battalion in the field. He'd never led tanks in battle, had no prior experience with armoured forces, and he simply hadn't gotten to grips with his new command. Auchinleck had second thoughts about Ritchie and sent his Chief of Staff, Eric Dorman Smith, to go around the 8th Army in February 1942 to talk to the various commanders with the excuse of monitoring staffing techniques. His real job, though, was to assess whether the other generals thought that Ritchie was up for the job. And, as it turned out, everyone thought that Ritchie was simply not the man for the job. Under Ritchie, 8th Army was presided over, not led. He remained a paradox, an impressive man who impressed very few. Churchill hinted to Auchinleck that Auchinleck himself should take command of the 8th Army, but this was simply not possible. Auchinleck was commanding the entire Middle East at this time and just couldn't do it. But he would hold Ritchie's hand, something that he complained about to one of his staff officers, and Auchinleck could not replace Ritchie without affecting the morale of the general public. It, after all, believed that Ritchie had led the 8th Army to victory over the Desert Fox during Crusader. I have already sacked one army commander. To sack another within 3 months would have effects on morale. But this may just be an excuse. Auchinleck was minded to remove Ritchie from command, but he realised that to do so would reflect badly on himself and his judgment in picking Ritchie in the first place. This irresolution on Auchinleck's part was because he realised that if Ritchie was dismissed, the most likely now General Officer Commanding-in-Chief was Montgomery, an officer he held in the very lowest regard. They did not like each other, and that antipathy would last until the death of Montgomery in 1976. But there were other problematic commanders too. Major General Dan Pienaar had been promoted after his performance as commander of the 1st South African Brigade during Operation Crusader. He was now in command of the 1st South African Division, and was already falling out with his new corps commander, General Straffer Gott, who had been promoted from commander of the 7th Armoured Division to commander of 13th Corps. Gott had been fighting in the desert since day one, had seen a rapid promotion, and had greater prestige. But, despite what his biographer Nash says, he wasn't that great of a commander. Nash is right about Pienaar though. Major General Dan Pienaar was a particularly difficult and recalcitrant officer. Indeed, he actively disliked Gott, though what led to this animosity has never been explained. The consequence of his very public, negative and uncooperative attitude was that Auchinleck readily appreciated that Gott was not entirely master of his divisions, and he tried to ensure that, if possible, the 1st South African Division was not entrusted with any vital operation. Gott also had a close friendship with General Norrie, 30 Corps commander, and the two sometimes made decisions together rather than let Ritchie run the show. Ritchie was also the same rank as Norrie and Gott, all were acting lieutenant generals, and while both had shown mediocre performance in the past, Norrie and Gott both had more experience commanding units in the field, and this was perhaps why Norrie disagreed with Ritchie over the direction of Rommel's attack, siding with Auchinleck and thinking that Rommel would just strike the Gazala line. Even more troublesome, Frank Messervy, commander of 7th Armoured Division, was concerned for his daughter, Rosemary, who had just fallen out of a window at school and was crippled in a hospital in Calcutta, which it was thought would soon be overrun by the Japanese. So Messervy's mind was preoccupied with that, and the commander of 1st Armoured Division, Herbert Lumsden, blamed Messervy for the poor handling of 1st Armoured Division during Operation Crusader. And so Lumsden didn't get on with Messervy and didn't think Messervy was fit to command armoured units. Therefore, in a battle where the British really needed their 2 armoured divisions to work as one, the 2 armoured commanders of those 2 armoured divisions hardly spoke to one another. To say that these senior command assignments for the senior manoeuvre formations was haphazard is an understatement. Amazingly, no Royal Tank Regiment officer had yet been assigned to command a British armoured division in combat, a strong indicator that pre-war regimental prejudices were allowed to influence the selection of command cadre. This is a vitally important point that needs to be understood, because this explains a lot of what is about to happen in this battle. The British tankers came from the old cavalry units and still had the old-fashioned belief that tanks were basically armoured horses. Throughout Operation Crusader, they had charged forwards without infantry or artillery support, rushing into destruction like the Light Brigade at Balaclava. Well, they hadn't learnt from this at all, and this mentality would result in disaster at the Battle of Gazala. Jealously protective of their own regimental histories and traditions, they still found cooperation with other tank regiments, let alone with artillery brigades and infantry battalions, a novel, baffling and invidious concept. However, Auchinleck and some of the other generals had learnt the lessons of Operation Crusader, and so they now tried to solve this problem. Tanks require the support of field artillery, anti-tank guns and motor infantry. The higher proportion of these supporting arms to actual tanks in the panzer divisions gave the Germans a distinct advantage. To our own tanks, the value of good support from 25-pounders was demonstrated time and time again. Therefore, it would appear that, in future, the Armoured Brigade Group should take the place of the Armoured Brigade. Auchinleck was persuaded by Gott to reorganise the British brigades into mixed brigade groups, with the infantry brigade groups consisting of 3 infantry battalions, plus a mixed battalion of artillery, anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and engineer units as well. 3 of these infantry brigade groups would make up 1 infantry division, while the armoured brigade groups would consist of 3 tank battalions, 1 motorised infantry battalion, and a mixed battalion of artillery and anti-tank guns. In theory, one of these armoured brigade groups plus a motorised infantry brigade group would make up 1 armoured division. However, Auchinleck's plans hadn't yet been fully implemented, so the old design of 2 armoured brigade groups and 1 motorised infantry brigade group remained. This meant that, while there was a more combined arms approach, they were still far too tank heavy. And even though Auchinleck told both Ritchie and Norrie not to have the brigade groups fight separately, the armoured divisions should fight as full divisions, the brigades and divisions wouldn't cooperate, and would go in piecemeal when the battle began. In fact, this battle was to show the British forces acting almost entirely as independent brigades, and the impression is that the existence of the divisional level of command served only to slow down the transmission of orders and cause confusion, at least among the armoured forces. So, the overall organisation of the British forces wasn't great, and worse, the British plan of defence relied on the British tanks themselves, and they weren't great either. It was known by the troops in the field and confirmed by a ministerial report back in England that the British tanks were awful. The main issue was the near obsolete 2-pounder anti-tank gun, which was the main gun mounted on the British tanks at this time. This weapon was simply too weak to penetrate the frontal armour of the German medium tanks at long distances. On top of that, the armour of the British cruiser tanks, the faster cavalry tanks, was also poor, and the American-built M3 light tanks, the Stuarts or Honeys, weren't much better than the British-built machines, meaning that the British tanks were at a significant disadvantage against the Panzers. The armour of the Matilda and Valentine infantry tanks were heavier, but these were slow tanks and also still had the 2-pounder anti-tank gun. Both of these infantry tanks were deemed to be too slow to be included in the armoured divisions themselves, and so were placed in separate army tank brigades. The British tanks were so inferior, in fact, that in order to compensate, Auchinleck believed he needed a 3-2 superiority in tank numbers, and even that might not be enough. The Italian tanks were terrible, so the British didn't really have to worry about them. It was the German tanks that were the main problem due to their decent armour. So what was desperately needed was an upgrade to the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, and that's exactly what they were getting now. The new 6-pounder anti-tank guns were beginning to arrive. Unfortunately though, only 112 of these had been received by the time the Battle of Gazala began, and there was also a lack of anti-tank guns in general. So while the infantry brigades had been bolstered on paper, in practice they were still vulnerable to panzer attacks. The British had been crying out for better tanks for a long time, and finally a new type of tank had started to arrive from America that was exactly what the British needed. The M3 medium tank now made its debut on the battlefield. These were also known as the Lee and Grant tanks, depending on the turret. And at the Battle of Gazala, the majority were Grant tanks, but there were some Lees as well. For ease though, I'm just going to refer to them as Grant tanks from now on. The Grant tank had a 75mm gun, which was far more powerful than the 2-pounders on the other British tanks, and also more powerful than the new 6-pounder anti-tank guns as well. Even better, the 75mm gun could fire both armour-piercing and high-explosive shells, which none of the other British tanks could do at the time. So this tank could take on enemy infantry effectively. The only drawback was that the 75mm gun was a sponson. It was in the side of the body of the tank, and thus had limited traverse. It also prevented the tank from going into a hull-down position behind cover because the hull needed to be exposed in order to fire the gun. It also hadn't received the latest armour-piercing ammunition, and the 37mm gun in the turret was just not worth the hassle. This turret made the tank taller, and thus more of a target for enemy guns. And while the 75mm was a great gun, the German 88mm flak guns could outrange it, as could the long-barrelled Panzer IVs, although the long-barrelled Panzer IVs didn't take part in Gazala because no ammunition had arrived for them. Still, with its good speed and heavy armour, plus its more reliable engine than the British cruiser tanks, the Grant was a good tank for its time. It was the first tank that the British had that was actually capable of taking on the German tanks head-to-head. Some have even argued that it was the best tank on the battlefield at the time, which may be debatable, but it definitely had the best gun of any tank right now, even if it was in the hull. And just to point out, the British had technically skipped a step. Tank forces in most armies at this time had gone from 37mm guns to 50mm guns, then to 75mm guns. The British went from a 40mm gun, the 2-pounder, straight to a 75mm gun, and they instantly noticed the difference in firepower. So it was no wonder that the Germans were about to be caught off guard by this tank. And yes, the British would get 6-pounders in their tanks after Gazala, but that leap from the 40mm to the 75mm in mid-1942 was a huge leap. Because not enough grants had arrived yet, the British decided to spread them out between the various tank battalions. They wanted each battalion to consist of 2 squads of Grants and 1 squad of Crusaders or Honeys depending, but there wasn't enough, so only Richard's 4th Armoured Brigade from 7th Armoured Division was equipped this way. The 2 armoured brigades in Lumsden's 1st Armoured Division had battalions with only 1 squad of Grants and 2 squads of Cruisers, which made each battalion weaker than the ones in 7th Armoured Division. The fact that Meservey got priority over Lumsden may have also contributed to the conflict between the 2 commanders. So, apart from the Grants, the majority of the British tanks had poor armour and weaponry. The British armour doctrine was terrible, and the British organisation left a lot to be desired. A British combined arms warfare doctrine hadn't yet been created, and as seen previously in the North African Campaign series, the British tank units had a tendency to become muddled and then not strike as one when they were needed. Spoiler alert, that's exactly what was about to happen again. On the 13th of February 1942, Gross Admiral Erich Raeder told Hitler that the British were primarily fighting in Africa to protect their Middle Eastern oil wells. Ever conscious of the oil crisis, Hitler was receptive to a new vision known as the Great Plan, which would see Rommel advancing into the Middle East to meet German forces coming south from the Caucasus. Of course, in order to pull this plan off, Rommel would need to be significantly strengthened, and to do that, the island of Malta would need to be neutralised. But this was like a chicken and egg scenario. In order for Rommel to advance, Malta would need to be suppressed, and in order to suppress Malta, Rommel would need to advance, to push the British Air Force back and prevent them from supporting Malta. So 2 plans were created: Operation Hercules, the invasion of Malta, and Operation Aida, the drive for the Nile. The island of Malta was really important and was causing the Axis a headache. Only 18,000 tons of supplies had reached the Panzer Army in March 1942, of the minimum of 25,000 tons needed. This obviously couldn't go on, so the island was hammered like never before by Kesselring's Luftflotte 2. This didn't sink the unsinkable aircraft carrier, as Malta was known as, but it did neutralise it. And from April onwards, reinforcements and supplies started to flow in, making a new advance in North Africa possible. With an attack now on the cards, Hitler and Mussolini met at Berchtesgaden at the end of April 1942 and decided that this new offensive should start at the end of May or early June, with a follow-up attack on the island of Malta in July. And so Rommel was ordered to advance and capture the vital port of Tobruk, but he was not to go beyond the Egyptian frontier. Only after Malta was taken out and once his supply routes were secure would Rommel be permitted to advance into Egypt. This was the first time that Rommel had the blessing of everyone on his side. He didn't have to worry about Halder or the Italians holding him back. It also seemed like this was a golden opportunity to attack, since the British had withdrawn their best troops, the Australians and New Zealanders. They only had the 1st South African Division and the inexperienced British 50th Division to defend the line with. Rommel also knew that British training wasn't the best. He dismissed their new tanks and anti-tank guns as being useless in the hands of men who didn't know how to use them, and he questioned the capability of the 8th Army's commanders to lead the troops in battle. He also criticised their strategy of having a fortified line with an open desert flank, practically inviting him to go round it, saying that a rigid system of static defence in the desert was bound to lead to disaster. Now, yes, he had respect for the copious amounts of mines that had been laid, and he knew that the strong points behind the Gazala line were garrisoned by strong infantry, artillery and armoured car units, but he also knew that such positions could be isolated and destroyed. The British had effectively split their forces into small penny packets, dissipating their strength, and would be ripe for annihilation, so Rommel was confident that his plan would work. He had a bit of a problem though. British armoured car units and other elements had prevented the Axis from conducting proper reconnaissance of the British positions, so Rommel didn't know that the minefields ran all the way down to Bir Hakeim. He thought they stopped about here on the map, and he assumed that the Bir Hakeim position was isolated. Thus, he thought he could drive his tanks straight through this area without much trouble. With this in mind, he decided to launch a feint attack with his infantry force, Group Kruvel, against the minefields to give the impression that this was the main attack. But it wasn't. Rommel would lead his mobile forces around the south, with the Italians on the northern flank heading straight into the minefields, while the panzer divisions drove on Bir Hakeim itself. They would all turn north, roll into the Knightsbridge area, defeat the British armour, and then eventually reach the coast. At the same time, an amphibious landing would be conducted by a unit called the Hecker Group, and these would meet up with the panzers, cutting off the British units on the Gazala line. The Axis would crush the South Africans in the British 50th Division, after which everyone would race to Tobruk, which would fall quickly, and they would all go on to Egypt, and then the Caucasus, and then the moon. While Ritchie's plan to fight a defensive battle at Gazala was unimaginative and timidly executed, Rommel's concept for Operation Theseus, or Theseus in German, was quite superficial, based on dangerous assumptions and aggressively conducted with little regard for unexpected outcomes. Rommel is known for being the Desert Fox, a great commander who outsmarted his opponents, and this was meant to be his greatest battle. And yet, the plan wasn't even his. It was created after a staff member of the 15th Panzer Division suggested it, and Rommel took it on board. And it's a flawed plan. General Bayerlein, who would soon become Rommel's chief of staff, said at the time that he didn't like this plan and told Rommel this repeatedly. The South African historians say this: Rommel was engaged in his first large-scale deliberate assault, but the plan which emerged is no particular advertisement for the military skill of himself and his staff. In the desert, at any rate, he was always a better tactician than strategist, and this particular operation combined a temperamental recklessness with superficial appreciation of his intelligence material in a way which ought to have cost him the victory. Rommel thought that Tobruk would be captured in about 4 days, and so his mobile divisions had supply columns in tow which had 4 days worth of rations and water, 3 days worth of ammunition, and enough fuel for about 300 miles. Clearly, the timings were extremely optimistic. And had Rommel actually attacked in the way his plan originally said, this probably would have been a disaster for him. But the Germans were accidentally being fed information from American Colonel Bonner Fellers in Cairo, and so they now learnt of something that would save the entire plan. It was discovered that the British armour was not where Auchinleck had wanted it. Instead, it was located northeast of Bir Hakeim. So, revisions were made. The entire advance was shifted south. The Italian mobile divisions were given the task of capturing Bir Hakeim on their own, while the rest of the Afrika Korps swept south of Bir Hakeim and then northwards. They would go around the minefields. This did dilute the attack on Bir Hakeim, which would have significant consequences in the coming battle, but ultimately this change at the 11th hour really did save the entire plan. Still, there were other issues though that weren't addressed. Rommel thought that Gott's 13th Corps had 2 divisions, but it actually had 3. He didn't know that Gott's 3rd Division, the 2nd South African Division, was in Tobruk. He also hadn't identified the 201st Guards and 3rd Indian Brigades in their positions, and didn't know that the 150th Brigade group was in the middle of the line. There were thus 5 more brigade groups facing Rommel than he was bargaining for, 1 infantry, 2 motorised, 2 armoured, and he had placed 1 infantry brigade group in the wrong position. So, Rommel had underestimated the strength of the force he was facing, and while he did know about the arrival of the new Grant tanks and the 6-pounder anti-tank guns, he didn't know any of the details and thus discounted them. As Rommel's intelligence officer remarked, "Perhaps, fortunately, we underestimated the British strength, for had we known the full facts, even Rommel might have balked at an attack on such a greatly superior enemy." But Rommel did have huge advantages on the tactical level. The 88mm flak gun outclassed every other weapon on the battlefield at this time, and could hit British tanks long before they could hit them back. Their 50mm Pak 38s were also decent enough to take on any British tank, and all the Panzer Mark IIIs had these guns, the most numerous tank on the Axis side. All the German medium tanks in the desert were also decently armoured, so all of the British tanks, apart from the new Grants, would have to get close in order to do any damage to them. Worse, 19 of the new Panzer IIIs had a longer barrelled 50mm gun as well, providing better muzzle velocity and penetration. Technically, the Panzer IVs with the long-barrelled 75mm gun were superior, but there were only 4 of these and no ammunition had arrived for them, so they didn't take part in this battle. Still, German anti-tank guns were used aggressively, being pushed well up with and in advance of the tanks. The British practice, on the other hand, employed them in the defence and very rarely as offensive weapons. Instead, the British commanders developed what General Auchinleck has called the idea that the Royal Armoured Corps was an army within an army, which could operate without reference to other arms of the service. The good news for the British was that the Italian anti-tank guns were worse than the British 2-pounders, and most Italian divisions were of poor quality, with the notable exceptions being the Ariete armoured and Trieste motorised divisions. Some of the Italian divisions were only at regiment strength, and the German 90th Light Division was more the size of a brigade. But Rommel would only use his Italian infantry to tie down the British, as his mobile elements won the battle, so really Rommel had the qualitative advantage here. The numbers are disputed, but there were roughly 90,000 Axis troops ready for the attack, many of whom were Italian. The Germans had 332 panzers and the Italians had 228 tanks, which is 560 Axis tanks in total. Bearing in mind that there were only 1,167 operational panzers on the Eastern Front in their 19 panzer divisions, so Rommel actually had a huge number of panzers and Italian tanks in comparison. Some have suggested that this was due to his prestige at the time, but it was probably because the logistics on the Eastern Front were terrible, even worse than they were in North Africa. So it may just be that the Axis were actually able to sustain a lot of tanks in this theatre. But anyway, the Axis had 704 aircraft in North Africa, of which either 497 or 542 were operational. The British, on the other hand, had 100,000 men at Gazala, some say 110,000, many being Indian and South African troops as well as some French. The British had 573 cruiser tanks in the 1st and 7th Armoured Divisions, and another 276 infantry tanks in the 1st and 32nd Armoured Brigades, bringing the total to 849 tanks. The 1st Armoured Brigade, with another 145 tanks, had been ordered to join the 8th Army, but wouldn't arrive until later in the battle. But if we do include them, the grand total for the British would be 994 tanks. And this number could have been much higher. Due to a shortage of radio sets and intercom equipment, over 300 tanks were held back because they lacked the means to communicate. As a result, a large backlog of tanks accumulated in warehouses around Alexandria and Suez. The good news for Rommel was that the British only had 190 operational aircraft in the Gazala area, although many sources say there were 604 aircraft in total, with the other aircraft being spread throughout the Middle East, which could potentially be called upon. It's not too important due to the fact that the German Bf-109s were superior aircraft to any aircraft the British had at the time, and the 8th Army didn't call upon the Desert Air Force that often, effectively making the Air Force near useless in this battle, as we're about to see. Not only did the Axis air strength outnumber the Allied, but also the Me-109F outperformed every other fighter in the desert, and there were 120 of them. It is quality rather than quantity that is generally decisive. Thus, for the Battle of Gazala, the British had almost double the number of tanks than the Axis, slightly more infantry, and were outmatched in the air. And since the British were relying heavily on their tanks, it would all come down to the tank battle. Could Rommel beat a British tank force twice the size of his own? Let's find out. In the days prior to the battle, the Axis had increased their reconnaissance and dive bombing activities, hitting railheads and other lines of communication. This indicated that Rommel was about to attack, and on the 26th of May 1942, he did. That afternoon, the Cruvell Group started to advance on the British positions under the cover of artillery, Stukas and a sandstorm. This feint operation was not serious at all, made little impact on the British lines, and resulted in one of the German regiment commanders being mortally wounded. At the same time, Rommel's motor and armoured forces concentrated in the south, concealed by sandstorms. In the evening, the dust settled, and Rommel set off to the southeast, watched by the 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment, which saw columns of vehicles heading towards Berhakim. Thus, surprise was lost for the Axis, or at least it would have been had 7th Armoured Division's headquarters not dismissed these reports. They still believed that the southern attack was merely a distraction, and that the main effort was going against the Gazala line. Overall, Rommel's move went smoothly, except for the Trieste Division, which hadn't received Rommel's updated orders and drove straight into the minefields further north. They also lost touch with the other units, making Rommel wonder what had happened to them. Still, the rest of the divisions rolled to the area south of Berhakim, and now camped for the evening to rest and refuel. As far as Rommel was concerned, the British didn't know that he was there, and he was optimistic about his chances. Overnight and into the early hours of the 27th of May 1942, a staff officer in 30 Corps, Major Carver, had listened to the reports of the reconnaissance forces and started ringing various generals and officers trying to prompt them into action. When he spoke to 7th Armoured Division's General Staff Officer, he was chastised for waking him up at 1 AM for listening to 7th Armoured Division's messages and was told to mind his own. Unable to get through to Messervy himself, Carver therefore woke up General Norrie and told him to ring Messervy. Norrie did, but Messervy told him not to worry, saying these reports were clearly inaccurate and that this was nothing more than an Italian feint. Norrie agreed with Messervy, and when Carver rang Lumsden at 1st Armoured Division, again speaking to the General Staff Officer, he was told that Lumsden had no intention of sending reinforcements to help Messervy, even if the main attack was coming from the south. The problem here was that they all believed that Auchinleck had been right, that the Germans would hit the main Gazala lines, not go around the flank, so they all dismissed the threat, thinking that this wasn't the main attack. When more reports came in that Rommel was parked south of Berhakim, Carver was desperate and woke Norrie again, pleading with him to do something. Norrie then rang Messervy and eventually convinced him to move the 4th Armoured Brigade forward. But while Messervy did order Richards to move south, it looks like Messervy still didn't fully believe the danger, and so most likely didn't tell Richards to hurry. This is probably why Richards decided to have a nice, leisurely breakfast before heading out. Oh, but wait, it gets worse. Norrie also rang Lumsden and asked him to send the 22nd Armoured Brigade south to help Messervy out, but Lumsden said no. He said that Messervy's tank brigades had twice as many Grant tanks than his own, so Lumsden argued that rather than have Lumsden go south to rescue Messervy, Messervy should move north to rescue Lumsden. What relevance this argument had to the developing tactical situation is now somewhat obscure, but it seems at the time to have convinced Norrie, who, to Carver's concern, refrained from giving Lumsden the direct warning order. The total result of all this was that nothing happened. Richards was the only one given the order to move, and he decided to eat breakfast first. And just to point out, Messervy later claimed that he was aware of Rommel's attack in the south and had asked Norrie if he could get the Corps battle ready. But this is contradicted by other evidence and the sheer fact that Messervy's own division did nothing, so it's likely that Messervy wasn't being entirely honest in his post-battle account. Messervy's statement to Corelli Barnett is suspect. Like most of his statements quoted in that book, it is affected by the desire to justify his own actions, a failing to which soldiers, like others, are prone. Anyway, in the early morning of the 27th of May 1942, the Axis armour started their move to the northeast. A forward observer for 30 Corps reported back to his superiors that he could see Axis tanks coming at him, but the officer he was talking to didn't believe him. "There is a cloud of dust to the south. It has the appearance of a military formation. There are no, repeat no, troops to your south. Through the haze I can now identify tanks. Difficult to identify, but possibly German Mark IVs. We repeat no, forces in your vicinity. I am counting Mark IVs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There is no doubt, repeat no doubt, that this is a large German force. Mark IVs number over 30, and there are also Mark IIIs and a large number of motorised infantry. This could be, I repeat, this could be the Afrika Korps moving at speed of approximately 30 miles per hour towards El Adam. There are no enemy forces in your area. It is, undoubtedly, the Afrika Korps moving at speed towards El Adam. I am under..." Silence followed. I love this exchange because it shows just how completely out of touch the British command were with what was going on. Even in the face of reality, they stuck to their beliefs, which is ultimately what led them astray in the coming battle. Now, up to this point, Rommel had advanced in one giant group and hadn't sent his reconnaissance forces forward first, meaning that he had no idea what was ahead of him. He had also ordered the Ariete Division to split from this group and move on Bir Hakeim. So, without realising that they were there, the Ariete Division rolled straight into the 3rd Motorised Indian Infantry Brigade, whose commander urgently reported to Messervy that he faced an entire German panzer division. He was wrong, it was the Italian Ariete Division, and it didn't matter anyway because Messervy didn't believe him. Well, this one infantry brigade in their hastily dug positions, because they had only just arrived, had no chance against an entire Italian armoured division. And having not received half of their anti-tank guns, the brigade was overrun within half an hour. The exact number of British casualties is not clear, but the survivors scattered back to the frontier, and while they would reform after the battle, this was clearly an early blow to the British. It was also a huge morale boost for the Italians, who now surged towards Bir Hakeim, their main objective. For the first time in the Second World War, Italian armoured units had won a significant offensive tactical victory, and without any help from their German allies. At this point, British air reconnaissance, requested by Carver, reported that hundreds of tanks were moving in the area southeast of Bir Hakeim. This information finally woke the British commanders up from their irrationality. But when Norrie rang Messervy and ordered him to send Richards' brigade forwards, he was told they weren't ready to move, and Richards only got going 20 minutes after 3rd Indian Infantry Brigade had been routed. Norrie then rang Lumsden, who once again argued that he shouldn't send the 22nd Armoured Brigade south. Norrie had to give him a direct order to get the tanks to move, but Lumsden responded saying that they weren't ready, so it would take time before they could actually do so. As these discussions were going on, the 90th Light Division had stumbled into, engaged and pursued the patrols of Renton's 7th Motor Brigade back to the Retmer box. At 08:30 hours they began to break down the defences at Retmer and had overrun the western portion of the box in just 15 minutes. The defenders had been given no warning of Afrika Korps' approach. In fact, 7th Armoured Division HQ had allowed half the garrison to go to Tobruk to swim. The brigade commander, Renton, who arrived back at his HQ on the morning of the 27th, found that there were not even enough men to man all the guns. So Renton's brigade began to retreat, and as they did so, a British supply dump containing copious amounts of whiskey was hit by the Germans and erupted in blue flames. Having finished his breakfast, Richards ordered his brigade to assemble as a combat formation 14 kilometers to the southwest. Thus, the 3 battalions of the brigade rolled out of their camps and moved separately towards this assembly point. Well, just 10 minutes after the 8th Hussars had started on their journey, the 15th Panzer Division was spotted racing towards them and a fight broke out. The Hunnies deployed first and were knocked out by the Panzers. As I took my squadron of Hunnies up a slight rise and reached the top, I saw what looked like the whole bloody German army coming up the slope below. I radioed back, "I'm engaging now," and put up the black battle flag. Well, any tank will shoot at anything resembling a command tank, so everyone fired at me. In minutes my tank was on fire and I was burned, quite badly as it turned out. But then the new Grant tanks showed up, and the 75mm guns mounted in their heavily armoured hulls started to take their toll. Because their 50mm guns struggled to penetrate the Grant's frontal armour, panzer after panzer began to explode, initially causing confusion in the German ranks. Unfortunately, our panzer units attacked without artillery support, although I had constantly been at pains to impress on them not to do so until our artillery had opened fire. There was also a British surprise awaiting us here, one which was not to our advantage: the new Grant tank. The advent of the new American tank had torn great holes in our ranks. After their initial shock, Oberstleutnant Tager rallied his panzers, sent a battalion around the flank, and with some 88mm guns, destroyed the 8th Hussars in isolation. They then turned to face the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, which was also quickly reduced to a handful of tanks, all of which had run out of ammunition. Not wanting his panzers split up, Neering had ordered 21st Panzer Division to halt when 15th Panzer Division was engaged, which not only caused conflict with him and Rommel, but also allowed the British 5th Royal Tank Regiment to pick off the panzers at a distance with their Grants, mortally wounding one of their battalion commanders without losing a single tank in return. Rommel arrived at Neering's headquarters 25 minutes later and immediately countermanded this order. Neering, who said of Rommel that he was a bit like Hitler in that he always imagined that the enemy would react exactly as he had anticipated, was outraged at Rommel's imperious attitude. This had been a surprisingly hard fight, but the Germans had won it, and the remnants of 4th Armoured Brigade withdrew east. At the same time, Renton's forces broke and fled northeast to Bir el Gubi, and so the 90th Light Division raced northwards, chasing Richards' brigade as it fled towards El Adam. During this move, Kleeman's division drove straight into General Messervy's headquarters, capturing Messervy and his staff. But unfortunately for the Germans, Messervy had concealed his rank and passed himself off as a private. This allowed him to escape with 2 of his officers some time later. Of course, in his absence, his division was leaderless and would remain so for the next 2 days until the 29th, making 7th Armoured Division largely impotent. To the west, the Ariete Division struck the Free French at Bir Hakeim, hoping to simply shatter them in place as they had the 3rd Indian Brigade. But the 6 French infantry battalions, including 2 from the French Foreign Legion, had 62 anti-tank guns, 26 field guns, and were well dug into their position, which was also surrounded by mines. In other words, this was a well-fortified position that wasn't going to be rolled over, especially since the French were determined to restore French honour after the disasters that had befallen their nation previously. Worse, emboldened by their previous victory, the Italian tanks attacked without infantry or artillery support, which was a critical mistake, and tank after Italian tank went up in flames. The commander of the Ariete Armoured Regiment was captured, and the attack ended with a clear French victory. So far, the Italians had lost 57 of their 228 tanks, and the Germans another 40 of their 332 panzers, although some of these would be repaired. The Grants and the new 6-pounders employed by the infantry had taken out 1 in 7 Axis tanks in the morning of the first day of the battle. So just because the Axis hadn't lost any units yet doesn't mean they weren't hurting. But clearly this morning was a complete disaster for the British. An entire armoured division had routed, and Norrie realised that his entire southern flank was now exposed, which is why he evacuated his headquarters into El Adam before the 90th Light Division got to him. Norrie then ordered the 22nd Armoured Brigade to reinforce the 4th Armoured Brigade, not realising that the 4th had already been beaten. So the 22nd Armoured Brigade finally got going, and after some time parked in front of the 21st Panzer Division plus elements of the 15th. Perhaps still thinking the southern attack was a feint and the main attack would come from the west, 2 of the 3 battalions in the 22nd Armoured Brigade were facing northwards when they came to a halt, and so were hit in the rear by the oncoming panzers. Worse, they were initially ordered not to fire back, mistakenly thinking that the enemy tanks were the survivors of the 4th Armoured Brigade. It was quickly realised that they weren't friendly tanks when their own vehicles started exploding. One survivor of this engagement explains that they had received conflicting and confusing orders from their superiors, which may explain this strange behaviour. But obviously, in this muddle, this was anything but a fair fight, and each British battalion was attacked separately again. The panzers fired shot after shot into each British tank, destroying 24 of them and a bunch of other guns within half an hour. Yet, even with all the advantages granted to them, the Germans still didn't have it all their own way. The collision was bloody. Oberleutnant von Hulsen was immediately killed by a round to the head. The commander rammed a field piece and also took one. He and his adjutant were dead. Rockall assumed command of the battalion. Right at the beginning of the fighting, one of the vehicles was hit and I was called forward. I moved up, jumped out of my vehicle and dressed the people in the open burns. Later I ran into my ambulance, it was full of wounded. Lumsden ordered the 22nd Armoured Brigade back to the Knightsbridge area, which they started towards, chased by the Germans, who struck the Grant tanks in their weaker rear armour. Now, up to this point, the Axis plan had gone very well, and Rommel even congratulated Neering for his efforts. But it was at this moment that the plan began to unravel. The German divisions were starting to run out of fuel and ammunition, and so came to a halt in exposed positions west of Knightsbridge, waiting for their supply columns to catch up. The 90th Light Division had also reached the area south of El Adam, but was stopped by the 9th Indian Infantry Brigade and the remnants of 4th Armoured Brigade. When the 2 German recon battalions attempted to dash up the Trig Capuzzo to cut off El Adam from its supply base, 4th Armoured Brigade smashed and routed them, causing the armoured cars to flee into the desert. As this was happening, isolated British commanders now independently decided to strike back at the Axis on their own, and so small battle groups began to nibble at the Axis formations and supply columns, doing fairly significant damage in the process. Though ad hoc in nature, these courageous actions started to turn the tide. And thanks to radio problems, Rommel had also lost communication with the 90th Light Division, and therefore set off to go find it, just as the 1st Army Tank Brigade struck west, and the 2nd Armoured Brigade hit the German right flank from the east, supported by 22nd Armoured Brigade. There were no anti-tank guns on the western flank, and so the British Valentines managed to charge into the heart of the German rear areas, which fled in their wake. On the other side, the British Grants did considerable damage to the German trucks, and 1 German infantry battalion had to be disbanded after losing 220 of its soldiers. The companies on the right let rip with their 50mm pack guns. I saw some of their shells bounce harmlessly off the Grants. On the other hand, the enemy's replying fire was grim. His shell bursts among our infantry were particularly deadly. I got my right gun into action. It stopped 1 tank. Several others were burning, but the bulk of them came on relentlessly. Now the tanks were right on top of the front lines in the sector to my right. I looked at Sergeant Weber's gun. A British tank had driven straight at it and over it. It was mangled. Weber himself had got away. We met him 100 yards up a wadi, with 8 other survivors. There was little left of the battalion. A shell from a Grant tank hit General von Verst's panzer, wounding him, and he was replaced by Colonel Krasserman from the division's artillery regiment. Neering ordered Colonel Vols to set up his 88mm guns, and they managed to halt the British tanks for a time, getting hit by artillery fire in return, and the British actually dominated this fight until a sandstorm forced an end to the combat. The British would go on to lose one more Grant tank when the crew accidentally set fire to it while brewing some tea. But the main thing now was that Rommel was cut off from his support to the south. The Ariete Division, having failed at Berhakim, robbed some German supply columns of fuel and moved north to join Rommel, but was stopped by the 1st Army Tank Brigade. So, Rommel's main forces were now in the heart of the British rear, somewhat disjointed, low on supplies, with the British armour buzzing around them. Nobody knew where the Trieste Division was, and after their action with the 4th Armoured Brigade, who were still trying to hurt them, the Axis had lost over a third of their tanks. By midnight, the seriousness of the German intelligence failures that had resulted in Rommel's underestimations of enemy strength and dispositions became apparent. The principal cause of our failure was our underestimate of the strength of the British armoured divisions. The advent of the new American tank had torn great holes in our ranks. Interestingly, the 8th Army had suffered far fewer armour losses on the first day than the Deutsches Afrika Korps, but it had lost about 1/3, 55, of its Grant tanks. The reversal of fortunes during the afternoon had been brought about far more by the independent action of British brigade, battalion, company and even platoon commanders than by any coordinating action at divisional, corps or army commander level, which on May 27th ushered in a period generally agreed to represent the nadir of British generalship during the Desert Campaign. It's no wonder that, despite the early successes, Rommel was actually angry, dissatisfied and worried at the end of the day. Taking out his anger on one of his tank commanders, Rommel kicked him in the rear for daring to bring back a slightly damaged panzer, claiming it needed repair. His officers discussed the situation, and his Chief of Staff, Alfred Gauser, suggested that they should withdraw and tell the High Command that the operation had only been a reconnaissance in strength to save face. But Rommel disagreed. He was still hopeful that he could make things better the next day, since the British command had shown themselves to be incompetent in deploying their armour. He therefore ordered that the attack north should continue, still trying to stick to the original plan. The British also couldn't accept that Messervy had been captured, and so assumed that he was just concentrating on waging the battle, which would have been a good thing if he had, but he wasn't. They also understood that most of their tank forces had actually just fallen back rather than been destroyed, and technically only the 8th Hussars had actually been fully lost so far. The 3rd Indian Infantry Brigade had also fled the battlefield, so that was a total write-off, but otherwise most of the British forces were still in action, at least in theory. The 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades had been gutted though, especially the former, and the Desert Air Force had done practically nothing, scared to intervene in case they hit their own troops. 6 British fighter squadrons had also been withdrawn from Gambut as a precaution. But since Rommel's forces were semi-surrounded in the middle of their lines, the British believed that they were in a good position. Ritchie reported to Auchinleck that Rommel's main attack had indeed come from the south, and Auchinleck admitted that Ritchie had been right and that he had been wrong. Still, Auchinleck told Ritchie not to rule out another attack against the South Africans, as the Germans liked to use pincers to envelop their opponents. And this effectively prevented Ritchie from employing everything he had against Rommel, as he had to keep forces at the Gazala line just in case. And with only out-of-date updates coming in, Ritchie had little choice but to play things defensively for the moment. Had he had perfect knowledge of Rommel's situation, then it would have made sense to counterattack, but since he didn't know how bad Rommel had it, he made the only decision he could: to wait. On the morning of the 28th of May 1942, Lumsden wanted to attack the German concentration at Sidra, but hesitated when he realised that they had at least 155 panzers, and his one division with 143 tanks wasn't going to be able to defeat this force on its own. Messervy and his division couldn't be called upon because they had been scattered, so Lumsden adopted a defensive stance. The 15th Panzer Division was shattered from the previous day's action, was now out of fuel, and couldn't continue north as intended. Only the 21st Panzer Division had sufficient supplies to do anything, so after a battle with the 8th Royal Tank Regiment in the morning, which it swatted away with its 88mm guns, Rommel ordered it to go north and try to reach the coast road. Unfortunately, they couldn't find a way down the escarpment, so they turned and took on the British position known as Commonwealth Keep. The small South African garrison, armed with 6 Italian anti-tank guns and some Spigot mortars, that's a rare one, offered stubborn resistance but ultimately had no chance. The position was quickly taken, and Rommel's only real move of the day was over. Lumsden hadn't realised that 21st Panzer Division had gone north, and so did nothing at first, except watch the 15th Panzer Division get hit by bombers from the Desert Air Force. Rommel did order the 90th Light Division to meet up with the Ariete Division at Bir el Hamet, currently under attack by 1st Army Tank Brigade, and so the 4th Armoured Brigade chased the 90th Light Division during this move, doing reasonable damage to it. 2nd Armoured Brigade then joined in the attack against the Italians, hurting them some more before Rommel sent some 88mm guns to stem the tide, and these held off the British. It has been argued that, with Rommel's forces split up and without sufficient supplies, why didn't all the British tank forces attack at once? Why did the 22nd Armoured Brigade do nothing? Why were the British only sending in one brigade at a time? Well, the given answer is that Lumsden didn't want to attack. May 28, 1942 should have seen the annihilation of the Afrika Korps. That it did not is less attributable to the brilliance of Rommel than the ham-fisted way the British generals fought the battle. The actions of 1st Armoured Division were disappointing, and it is difficult to understand the lack of drive. It seems that General Lumsden's chief concern was to keep his Armoured Brigade out of action in case they came under 7th Armoured Division's control. Neither division used its infantry in cooperation with its tanks. But I disagree with the first point. Carver makes it clear that Lumsden thought that he was facing both panzer divisions and was calling upon Norrie to give him as many guns and units as possible. And he had actually attacked, but was held off by the 88s. Yes, arguably he should have attacked with 22nd Armoured Brigade as well, but the fact is that he didn't know 21st Panzer had gone north, so it's understandable why he didn't move that unit. Anyway, Rommel went out to visit the 15th Panzer Division, and shortly after he left, his headquarters was overrun and scattered by British armour, with Rommel's windscreen getting smashed. However, he did finally get back in touch with the Trieste Division, which was clearing a gap through the minefields ahead of it, along with the Brescia Division in its position. This was good news because Rommel's supply lines were having to go around Berhakim and were vulnerable to British interdiction. So if supplies could go straight through the minefields, that would shorten the distance and help protect them as well. That evening, General Ritchie was happy with how the battle had progressed so far, and it helped that he was totally out of touch with the reality on the ground. Auchinleck shared Ritchie's optimism, as Rommel's original plan had obviously failed, and the Axis probably only had 250 operational tanks left. But while the British may have had more tanks than Rommel, Auchinleck still urged caution, fearing that the Germans might have recovered from their initial setback. And indeed they had. Ritchie's estimate was a little optimistic. Rommel had suffered about 200 tank losses so far, leaving 360 out of the original 560 left, far more than the British estimate. Out of the original 849 tanks, Ritchie had 330 left, 240 cruisers and 90 infantry tanks, meaning that they had lost about 519 tanks. They had lost almost as many tanks as the Axis had started with. Worse, the Axis now had more tanks than them as well, and even though another 40 cruisers and 30 infantry tanks would arrive the next day, the British were clearly at a disadvantage at this moment. At dawn on the 29th of May 1942, the Italian Sabrata Division attacked the South African position at El Hamza. According to one eyewitness, a mortar shell signalled the beginning of the attack, after which the Italians rose as one and charged forwards in a wave. But then the South African artillery and machine guns opened up and everything went wrong. Running into mines, the Italian attack broke up and some of them wandered northeast into the area where the 2nd South African Brigade was, only to be chewed up there as well. After 15 minutes, the Italian attack was over, and the South Africans took 400 Italian soldiers and 13 officers prisoner. Just to make things worse for the Axis, as General Cruvell was flying back to his forward headquarters in his Storch aircraft, the flares that should have guided him weren't fired. So he flew too far, and British machine guns riddled his plane with bullets, destroyed the engine, and killed the pilot. Cruvell was in the back seat, and just had to wait for his plane to somehow land by itself, behind British lines. Miraculously, he survived the fall, but he was captured. Fearing that an Italian general, perhaps Navarrini, might take over, von Mellenthin convinced Field Marshal Albert Kesselring to take over the Cruvell group and subordinate himself to Rommel, a colonel general. Just to note, Wikipedia says that Cruvell's pilot mistook British soldiers for Italians, landed, and that's why they were captured. But it's getting its information from a random American newspaper that has nothing to do with North Africa. And we all know how accurate American journalism is, especially during the middle of a war. With one dubious exception, every single history book I have says Cruvell was shot down, including Rommel, with Kitchen, Mitcham and Moorhead specifically saying his pilot was killed. Therefore, Wikipedia is wrong yet again. His dead pilot's blood was still splashed on his boots when I saw him at Gambut. Anyway, the supply situation was now desperate for Rommel. Rommel found one of his supply columns in a complete mess east of Bir el Hamet, and so personally led it through an area contested by the British, getting shot at along the way. He did succeed in reaching the 15th Panzer Division, which helped, but the supply crisis remained. Rommel also understood that the Grant tank was a problem, even if the British weren't using them right, and so these factors convinced him to abandon the original plan. To protect against the Grant, it made sense to form an all-round defensive hedgehog position at the minefields, while the Italians carved paths through the minefields, shortening the distance that his supply columns needed to go. He therefore ordered his divisions to converge in the area west of the Knightsbridge position. This strategy makes more sense when you realise that Rommel didn't know that the 150th Infantry Brigade, supported by 30 Matilda tanks from 1st Army Tank Brigade, was sat at the Gazala position where Rommel wanted to be, and were able to dominate the gaps in the minefields that the Italians were trying to carve. So Rommel would soon have to deal with the 150th Brigade if he was to secure this cauldron of his. To fulfill Rommel's new orders, the 21st Panzer Division moved south from Commonwealth Keep. Seeing this, Foot's 7th Royal Tank Regiment moved into its path in order to block it, and in a foolhardy attempt to stop them, Foot charged his slow-moving infantry tanks at the Germans, got seriously battered, and then fell back. A pointless waste of lives. Elsewhere, the British also tried to launch an attack from the Knightsbridge area, but this was plagued by poor coordination between the various commanders. Norrie ordered Messervy to send the weakened 4th Armoured Brigade to join Lumsden, but this had already been ordered back to El Adam to act as a reserve, allowing the 90th Light Division to move uncontested towards Bir el Hamet, as the Ariete Division moved north to join the Panzers. They ran into the 2nd Armoured Brigade, who were moving west towards the 15th Panzer Division. The 22nd Armoured Brigade should have been with the 2nd, but they were stopped by a sandstorm, although one historian says they weren't even called for support. Nonetheless, there was an exchange of fire, but for whatever reason, the British decided not to stop to fight the Italians. Instead, they continued until they found the 15th Panzer Division, which had been moving west as well. But the panzers now turned about and, coupled with the German anti-tank guns, started a battle with the British. Obviously, one British armoured brigade stood no chance against an entire German panzer division, especially with the Italian armoured division on their flank, and this situation was made monumentally worse when the 21st Panzer Division appeared from the north. Hit on 3 flanks by panzers, pack anti-tank guns and 88mm flak guns, the British Crusader tanks were quickly annihilated. The Grants were surprisingly tough nuts to crack though, and their 75mm guns hammered the German panzers in return. The 22nd Armoured Brigade finally moved up to support, and the battle continued for the rest of the day as a sandstorm hindered visibility. But in the evening the British withdrew east and the Germans fell back to the west, ending the battle and forming Rommel's Cauldron overnight. Plant says that, although it wasn't realised at the time, this defeat was the decisive point of the Battle of Gazala. And it had been a close-run thing, because the panzer divisions reported that their ammunition was exhausted. Had the British been more vigorous in the previous days, it's possible that the panzers would have been out of ammunition and the battle would have been won. But by the end of the day, both sides were exhausted. The British were still optimistic, misinterpreting Rommel's move as a desperate attempt to retreat, and so the Axis tanks appeared to be pinned against the minefields and rapidly running out of supplies. It was only a matter of time, the British thought, until Rommel exhausted his ammunition, at which point they would win. Rommel was now firmly ensconced, even trapped by some definitions, in what quickly became known as Der Hexenkessel, the Cauldron. This was his back-to-the-wall moment in this battle, which would forever define him as a military commander. Ritchie wanted to use his artillery to hammer the Germans, while the British tanks and motorised infantry intercepted Axis supply lines. So eager were they that both he and Auchinleck began discussing the idea of using Gott's infantry to strike south and cut off Rommel entirely. Once Rommel was destroyed, Auchinleck said, they would then begin an advance to Machili and Benghazi. Quite rightly, the British commanders were thinking big. But the basis of their hopes, which were that the enemy armour was cornered and wasting away, was soon to be shattered. On the morning of the 30th of May 1942, 5th Panzer Regiment and some engineers and infantry moved west to Sidi Mufta to try and open a supply route through the minefields. Shortly thereafter, they ran into British infantry supported by both anti-tank guns and Matilda tanks, and 11 panzers were left burning on the battlefield. The mission was, therefore, called off for now, and it was at this moment that Rommel realised where the 150th Brigade was. And note, Rommel was in trouble, but he had no intention of escaping west. He just wanted to open supply routes through the minefields. Yet, Auchinleck and Ritchie didn't see it that way. Today, I have not sufficient information to say whether or not the enemy is trying to draw off, but everything is aiming at stopping the gap through which he might escape, and all is ready to cling to him continually. I hope shortly to get more ground information. Message just in. Enemy appears to be trying to break out west through minefield. Pray he does not escape. We will watch out for the dangers of a rebound. Norrie wanted to strike from the Knightsbridge area towards the minefields, hoping to cut Rommel's supply lines once more. He reported to Ritchie that his forces were doing very well, which was simply not true. Lumsden was also determined to get through to the 150th Brigade, and, believing that the Germans were retreating, he sent the 9th Lancers, the Queen's Bays, and the 3rd Country of London Yeomanry against the Asla Ridge. This was guarded by the Arietti Division, plus 90 anti-tank guns, supported by some 88mm flak guns, so the British were smashed long before they reached the ridge. The result was hardly surprising, but according to their regimental history, General Lumsden, who had been present for most of the time, thought they had done jolly well. 22nd Armoured Brigade spent the day skirmishing against Axis forces to the southeast of Knightsbridge, as this soldier from the 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Hussars recounts. The subsequent days and nights in the Cauldron were sheer hell. Those who managed 4 hours sleep a night were lucky. By the time crews had withdrawn to Liga, refuelled, reloaded and did some maintenance, it was midnight. Guards had to be mounted, and first light was at 4 AM. Then it was off again to face the Hun for a 16-hour day. Of course, this is where the Germans may have had an advantage, because they were supposedly on the drug Pervitin, which kept them more awake and alert. Sleep deprivation aside, the 4th Armoured Brigade chased a bunch of German tanks southwards, which later turned out to be about 60 Italian vehicles, all of which were captured by the British. The Desert Air Force did strike at the Axis transports, but lost 13 of their fighters to the Bf-109s and Macchi 202s. The 201st Guards Brigade also decided to send a Jock column westwards, but it ran into an anti-tank screen set up by the 21st Panzer Division, who hit them hard, and they lost 5 25-pounders, 7 6-pounders, and 157 men, all for nothing. These attacks effectively exhausted 30 Corps' offensive power. Both the 2nd and 22nd Armoured Brigades were reduced to 1 battalion worth of tanks each, and these were busy reconsolidating their forces after the previous defeats. So overall, not a great day for the British. Lumsden realised that his tanks weren't going to get through the Axis anti-tank screens until the British infantry and engineers had cleared the route first, and so the 10th Indian Infantry Brigade made its way from Gambut to reinforce the effort. This famous picture was taken on the 31st of May 1942, so I wanted to show it and identify who was in it. From left to right we have Brigadier George Erskine, 13th Corps Chief of Staff, Generals Norrie, Ritchie, Gott, and then someone else. I don't know who the person is on the right, but presumably it's 30 Corps Chief of Staff, which would make him Brigadier George Seton Hatton. On the morning of the 31st of May, Ritchie and his corps commanders wanted to try and implement Auchinleck's offensive plan, Operation Limerick, the attack to the west. But Gott and Norrie said that the British armour would have to remain in the Knightsbridge area in order to prevent Rommel from striking east, and so nothing could be done for now. And apart from Renton's 7th Motor Brigade, which managed to get supplies through to the French at Bir Hakeim, something they would do 3 more times between now and the 7th of June, the British didn't do anything on this day. Ritchie reported to Auchinleck that he was trying to get to the 150th Brigade, but in reality he was doing nothing of the sort, and didn't even know how serious the situation was for Hayden's brigade. Rommel asked Brigadier Hayden if he would like to start surrender negotiations, but Hayden formally declined. And so German artillery opened up and the 90th Light Division attacked. They didn't get very far and took heavy casualties, so the Panzers were called in for support. But Hayden's 6-pounders and Bofors anti-aircraft guns also resisted strongly, preventing the Germans from taking more than some of the forward positions. The fight continued all day, and with just 5 Valentine tanks left, the pocket shrank back. The Trieste Division also had a go at the Green Howards, but didn't get anywhere, showing that the British infantry had their act together. It was mainly the British armoured forces that were lacking at this stage. Hayden's stubbornness meant that supplies didn't get through to Rommel all day, and his men and their prisoners were having to ration everything, including water. They were only given half a cup of water per day, prompting Rommel to tell a complaining British major that if they didn't get a convoy through that evening, he would have to ask Ritchie for terms. He even said that the major could deliver the message to Ritchie himself. And yes, Rommel was almost forced to surrender. We could spare little for our prisoners, who were mostly men of the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade. Even our own troops surreptitiously tapped water from radiators to drink. We were in a really desperate position, our backs against the minefield. No food, no water, no petrol, very little ammunition. In another 24 hours, we should have had to surrender. At the last moment, supplies did get through to Rommel, and he didn't have to surrender. But it's worth emphasising that this was a near-run thing. Only water and ammunition arrived on the 31st, and food only came through on the next day, with one book describing the men as half-starved by that point. So had the British been more decisive, or had Hayden somehow held out longer, this could have been a disaster for the Axis. As is so often the case in warfare, a badly bungled operation did not end up as a complete debacle thanks to a truly astonishing display of military incompetence on the part of the adversary. On the 1st of June 1942, Stukas and artillery pounded the 150th Infantry Brigade, and the British Desert Air Force took the day off. Despite not really doing anything due to sandstorms and fears of hitting their own troops, they had lost 50 of their original 250 aircraft by this point. This prompted Air Vice Marshal Conyngham to call for replacements, and they did receive some additional Spitfires, Yet it's hard not to conclude that the Desert Air Force was simply not performing well. Finally, Ultra Intelligence had informed the British that Rommel wasn't withdrawing, but was in fact holding them off with an anti-tank screen while he recovered his composure and got through the minefields. Ritchie had organised an attack, but it wasn't ready by the 1st of June, and some of the forces couldn't be used at all as hoped. The 69th Brigade was supposed to have struck south, but unable to pull units out of the defence line, this ended up being called off. Then the 10th Indian Infantry Brigade only received its orders at the last minute and also wasn't able to reach the battlefield in time, so Messervy called off the attack and the British did nothing again. And because the British tanks weren't putting that much pressure on Rommel's northern or eastern flanks, this meant that Rommel was able to take troops, including the entire 21st Panzer Division, from his outer pocket and shift them to attack the 150th Infantry Brigade. At one crucial moment, Rommel took personal command of the leading infantry platoon, possibly the first time a military formation of so small a size was taken into action by so high-ranking an officer. The British resisted for as long as they could, and managed to wound Generals Gauser, Rommel's Chief of Staff, and Westphal, his operations chief, as well as some other battalion commanders. But Brigadier Hayden was killed by an artillery shell, and the surviving men ran out of ammunition. When Rommel ordered his own forces to wave white flags at the British to indicate that they would accept prisoners, the exhausted British soldiers decided to surrender, and the 150th Infantry Brigade ceased to be. On the morning of the 2nd of June 1942, Ritchie received confirmation that the 150th Infantry Brigade had been destroyed. But he still believed Rommel was surrounded, that the British still had the advantage, and that all he had to do was order Gott's 13th Corps to strike south. If this happened, Rommel would be doomed, he thought. But while Rommel was still in trouble, he had now regained the initiative. More supplies had gotten through the minefields, and he wasn't willing to just sit there and wait for the British to destroy him. With his tanks holding the Cauldron, Rommel sent the Trieste and 90th Light Divisions south, with the ultimate objective of capturing Ber Hakim from the French. These were hit along the way by the RAF, slowing their progress, burning their vehicles, and downing several Luftwaffe aircraft in the area, as well as over the next few days. All this boosted French morale, prompting the French general to thank the RAF for their efforts. At the same time, Rommel also sent the 21st Panzer Division towards Elwet et Tamar in the north. Norrie sent 4th Armoured Brigade to intercept, but in a sandstorm, the two British tank battalions became separated, and the 5th Royal Tank Regiment ended up in combat alone. The German panzers suddenly appeared right in front of them, with one German squadron rolling right past the leading British tanks before the British had time to respond. But they did, and both sides started firing at point-blank range. We began firing. My troop officer was the first to be hit and set on fire. It was a case of firing into the enemy tanks as fast as you could, and there wasn't much chance of jinking forward or back because the tanks all along our line were beginning to burn. The Germans destroyed 12, 18 or 19 tanks depending on the source, and killed the commander of the 5th Royal Tank Regiment, leaving the unit with just a handful of tanks left. There's no record of German losses, and again there was no major attack on the Axis Cauldron, wasting another day. What you're about to hear is the story of one of the worst military disasters in British history, and mightily annoyed you'll be, for even Rommel was frustrated by the sheer incompetence that the British displayed in this engagement. It's easy to describe what happened, but deciding who was to blame has been a controversial issue ever since. So for that reason, I think it's necessary to really dive into the details with this section, especially since a lot of the early histories were very one-sided. On the 3rd of June 1942, Ritchie informed Auchinleck that the 150th Infantry Brigade had been destroyed, but he cushioned the blow by saying that they still had the initiative, and that things were getting better. They really weren't though, and Auchinleck saw that Rommel had actually punctured the heart of the British Gazala lines. Still, Auchinleck gave Ritchie the benefit of the doubt, thinking that perhaps Ritchie had more up-to-date information than Auchinleck did in Cairo. But he also told Ritchie not to lose the initiative. Well, unwilling to attack the Germans and realising that the Italians were the softer target, both Auchinleck and Ritchie thought that an offensive by 13th Corps, perhaps with the tanks from 30th Corps, was the best way to go. Some of their forces could take Ber Temrad, while others could strike south and cut off Rommel's forces once more. However, before issuing the orders, Ritchie decided to hold a war council with his commanders to gain a consensus. But everyone disagreed with Ritchie. Norrie and Messervy were against the idea of using their tanks because they were busy fighting Rommel, supposedly. This meant that the strike south would have to be conducted purely by Gott's 13th Corps. But one of Gott's division commanders was against the plan, and nobody should be surprised to learn that Pienaar was anything but receptive to this adventure, forcing the British to rethink their plans. Desperate to do something, or anything, Major General Briggs of the 5th Indian Division was asked if he could move up to the front and strike through the British and South African lines and advance to Tamimi, which was miles away. General Briggs wrote that, though the 5th Indian Division was supposed to be in general reserve at the start of Rommel's offensive, in fact every brigade and some battalions even had been taken out of his control and placed directly under one of the two corps, or under the armoured divisions. In this whirlpool battle, brigades were swapped from one command to another. Briggs called his own headquarters a HQ on ice and was occasionally given formations to look after for a day at a time. It was not till Rommel had established himself in our minefields, had overrun 150th Brigade and was threatening Ber Hakim that I was called in. I had to collect the division, plan, reconnoitre and attack within 36 hours. I never thought harder in my life. The plan was unworkable, and so Briggs suggested an alternative, which Ritchie and Gott agreed with. Briggs said that it would be better to go south around Ber Hakim and then straight to Tamimi instead. I genuinely don't know how this was meant to be the easier option, which then suggests we're not being given the true account of what was being planned, but Briggs did explain that this would allow him to keep his division together as one, whereas apparently that wouldn't happen if he just went straight to Tamimi. Again, it doesn't really make sense. Well, anyway, someone then went to do the calculations and realised that it was logistically impossible to send this division around the southern flank, and so this entire plan was off the cards as well. But even if they had wanted to do that, sending a tankless infantry division unprotected around Rommel's flank was probably not a good idea, so why they even considered this is beyond all comprehension. And despite later implying that he hadn't suggested this, Messervy then offered yet another alternative plan of action. He said that their best and only option was to crush the Axis Cauldron in a simple head-on attack, which they should have done days ago. So a new plan, Operation Aberdeen, was hatched, whereby 30 Corps would strike west from Knightsbridge using infantry. These would clear the anti-tank screen for the tanks, who would then follow up, and at the same time 13th Corps would strike the Sidra Ridge, and then later advance on Tamimi apparently. As you can tell, there are several problems with the sources, but also several problems with the plan, and it's at this bit where the histories really diverge from one another. They all agree that there was a split in command, but their explanation doesn't make sense, and there's contradictions all the way down, so I'm going to try my best to make sense of it here. What is 100% certain is that Ritchie gave the order for Operation Aberdeen, but the attacks went in separately again. I have sent my orders for tomorrow, but I know my corps commanders will hold a tea party on them, and whether they will comply with my exact intentions is questionable. This sad and revealing remark badly reflects on Norrie and Gott, who by now seem to have forgotten the precepts of discipline fundamental to any army. In my absence, the whole plan was changed to a frontal attack against Rommel in his prepared position, and we were not to be a complete division after all. Command of the operation would alternate between 5th Indian Division and 7th Armoured Division, according to the formations which were chiefly engaged. In reality, there was little coordination between the two division commanders, Briggs and Messervy, after the initial attack, and their divisions just operated separately, leading to disaster as we'll see. We also know that Gott refused to participate in the advance. This was either because he thought his headquarters wasn't suited to the task of commanding the tank forces, or because he thought that the infantry would advance like they did in the First World War and get slaughtered. Either way, Gott wasn't really involved here. But what happened with Norrie is more difficult to figure out. One source says that Norrie was just bypassed by Ritchie and was left out of the chain of command, suggesting that Ritchie was to blame. Another source says that Ritchie left his subordinates to run the show, meaning that he wasn't in charge and therefore wasn't to blame. And other sources say that Norrie wasn't bypassed, but that he, for whatever reason, delegated command to Briggs and Messervy and just didn't take ownership of the plan, resulting in disaster. So none of the sources are in agreement when it comes to Norrie. When we have a contradiction, that indicates that something is not right, usually a distortion of history or a lie. And because Operation Aberdeen ends up being the worst tank battle in British history, it makes sense that whoever was in charge of this plan doesn't want to be blamed for the worst tank attack in British history. So, isn't it strange that all the sources just so happen to contradict each other when it comes to whether Norrie was or was not in command? And considering that the 22nd Armoured Brigade was taken off Lumsden and given to Messervy, and that this order couldn't have come from Lumsden because why would he give tanks to Messervy, whom he hated? This indicates that Norrie was taking active steps to implement the plan. We also know Norrie's headquarters radioed the 8th Army on the 4th of June saying, "Commanders concerned in Aberdeen full of beans and happy." So, while Briggs and Messervy might have planned out the details, Norrie was active in the operational planning as well. Does it really make sense then that he just so happened to not be in charge of the operation when it was launched? There's no reason for Ritchie to take command of this attack. This was what his corps commander should have been doing. There's also no reason for Ritchie to bypass Norrie and then not take command of the attack, so it wasn't Ritchie's fight. He may take responsibility for the disaster because he's the army commander, but his corps commander should have been doing the planning. Logically, this leaves us with two options. Norrie was in command but later pretended that he wasn't, in which case the fault lies with him, or Norrie delegated to Briggs and Messervy, which split the command and thus resulted in disaster, in which case the fault lies with Norrie. Either way, Norrie is definitely to blame here. And it's interesting because most of the history books, especially the early ones, pin the blame on Ritchie. I just don't understand why they wouldn't call out Norrie, whose family are rich barons currently active in the British and New Zealand governments, with Norrie himself becoming a politician and governor in South Australia and later New Zealand, suggesting that politics may have been a factor as to why they avoided pinning the blame on Norrie. So Norrie was in charge, and Norrie did a poor job in coordinating the various arms, with the result that the British infantry and tanks would go in separately once more, giving the Axis a clear advantage. This was in addition to the fact that the British tank force was already in a dire state at this point and just not up to the task. Plus the British erroneously thought that the 15th Panzer Division was with the 90th Light Division at Ber Hackheim, which it wasn't. So this attack, Operation Aberdeen, was just not going to work. And as these discussions were going on, the Axis had gotten through the minefields, making Rommel's supply situation significantly easier. In addition, the 90th Light and Trieste divisions had reached the French at Ber Hakim and began using their 105mm artillery guns to shell the position, which the French couldn't respond to because their 75mm artillery guns had a shorter range. Luckily, the French trenches and gun positions were underground, making it difficult for the German artillery and Stukas to even find them, let alone hit them. So when Rommel asked Koenig if he wanted to surrender, Koenig didn't even bother to answer him. Nothing much happened on the 4th of June 1942, except that Rommel wanted to salvage some abandoned tanks near Bir el Hamed, and therefore opened a gap in the minefields in the area. As von Mellenthin, his new chief of operations, would later describe, this was a great stroke of luck, which will become incredibly important shortly. Rommel could also tell that the British were gearing up for an attack and prepared his forces accordingly. So, at 0250 hours on the 5th of June 1942, Operation Aberdeen, Ritchie's attack on the Cauldron, began, and it immediately went wrong. The opening artillery barrage hit empty ground because the British had mistakenly thought that the German and Italian lines were further east than they actually were, which also meant that the 10th Indian Infantry Brigade reached their objective without much trouble, again because they had advanced into empty ground. Then they ran into the Ariete Division, which resisted fiercely but took a beating and were driven off Asla Ridge. However, the Germans counterattacked, halting the Indian infantry and throwing some back. Well, as agreed, the 156 tanks of 22nd Armoured Brigade came forward and raced through the Indian infantry into a wall of anti-tank guns, which then opened fire on the British armour. The only reason they were not annihilated was that the shells raised so much dust that the gunners could not see their targets. The survivors of this hail of shells sheared off to the north, chased by the 8th Panzer Regiment and other elements. The 22nd Armoured Brigade ran into another line of guns from the 21st Panzer Division, where they were engaged again by the panzers. Heavy losses were incurred, and it's probably about this time that the commander of the 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, Colonel Burley, was killed. And because the tanks had been told by Messervy not to help the infantry, since, in his words, the infantry were self-protecting, the remaining tanks of 22nd Armoured Brigade withdrew behind the infantry, leaving the infantry to bear the brunt of the German panzers and Italian armour, which then charged into them. Because they were meant to be on the attack, the British 2-pounders weren't dug in, and so were quickly knocked out, resulting in the units getting rolled over by the Axis tanks. The survivors fell back, and to add to the misery, in the north, 32nd Army Tank Brigade drove into a minefield, and then was hit by intense anti-tank fire coming from the Sidra Ridge. A whopping 50 of its 70 infantry tanks were destroyed, with the remaining 20 withdrawing from the battlefield. From the tactical point of view, this was one of the most ridiculous attacks of the campaign. Both the 7th Armoured and 5th Indian Divisions realised that they were losing the battle, but because Ritchie had failed to assign someone to coordinate both divisions, supposedly, the commanders separately came to the decision that they had to keep fighting in order to support the other division. Thus, the battle continued and losses piled up. Then the 2nd Armoured Brigade, with its 1 battalion of armour, was placed under 7th Armoured Division and moved south at first, but then fell back when it received several contradictory orders that it didn't know what to do with, so they just went around in circles as the rest of the British force took a pummeling. Rommel, meanwhile, assessed the situation and believed correctly that his northern flank was safe. So he propped up his eastern flank with the Ariete and 21st Panzer Divisions, and personally led the 15th Panzer Division through the newly carved gap in the minefields to the southwest. 15th Panzer Division overwhelmed the lone British battalion at Bir el Hamet, then linked up with forces coming from the Bir Hakeim area before Rommel led this united force northwestwards, scattering or wiping out numerous British units, destroying the British command and control, and cementing his dominance on the battlefield. Messervy was captured again, but escaped again, and 21st Panzer Division also came south, trapping 3 Indian battalions, 4 artillery regiments, and the support group of 22nd Armoured Brigade at the Asla Ridge. As Plant says, this was one of the few double envelopments in modern warfare, and as Barnett says, it had taken 4 days for the British to plan the attack and half a day for Rommel to launch a stunning counterattack. Our left flank had evidently not been guarded. Its protection was such an obvious necessity that it never occurred to me personally to ask what that protection was. I assumed that my 9th Brigade and 10th Brigade would not be asked to advance 5 to 8 miles into the enemy positions without adequate steps having been taken to protect the southern flank. The RAF had also failed to help once again, turning down numerous requests by the army units for support, on a day which saw at least 110 British tanks, 1 infantry brigade, and 4 field artillery regiments get destroyed. What's possibly the most surprising thing about this was just how upset Rommel was at the British. Even Rommel couldn't believe that the British had wasted their men as they had. Why hadn't they sent in everything they had, he asked. Why hadn't they coordinated their units? What is the use of having overall superiority if one allows one's formations to be smashed piece by an enemy who, in each separate action, is able to concentrate superior strength at the decisive point? And historian Barry Pitt, in his excellent Crucible of War series, highly recommended, spends half a page just ripping into the British commanders, saying that Gott and Norrie were emasculated and subsequently lost confidence in themselves. The men also lost confidence with their commanders, which Pitt says is a state of mind that persisted until during or even after the Second Battle of El Alamein. So this wasn't just a tactical mistake. This was the final nail in the coffin for British morale, and it had massive implications going forward. Love him or hate him, and I don't particularly like the guy, but this is why Montgomery was important. He came down like a ton of bricks on the desert commanders, he wiped the slate clean, and he didn't commit to battle until he was ready. The British had learned through error and defeat that if you send your unprepared forces into an ad hoc battle against the best that the Germans had to offer while they were at their peak, you would get slaughtered. So why was Monty slow and methodical? Because when the British weren't slow and methodical, they got Operation Crusaded or Operation Aberdeen. That's why. And yes, I'm jumping ahead here, but this is why I wanted to start the North African Campaign series from the very beginning, so that you could see why the British drew certain conclusions and why Monty was the way he was. But back to the battle. The only real successful action on this day for the British was that the 7th Motor Brigade, along with the 4th South African Armoured Car Regiment, advanced northwest into the rear of the Axis formations at Bir Hakeim, wiping out numerous trucks, several tanks, a bunch of other equipment, and captured a truckful of German beer. They even took Rotunda Metiefel, planted mines on the Axis supply routes, and then fell back. It begs the question of what could have been achieved if this force had had tank support. At the same time, the 1st South African Brigade attacked the Italian Trento Division, doing significant damage to it and to Rommel's supply lines. And it was during this action that Sergeant Quentin Smythe won the first of only 5 Victoria Crosses given to South African soldiers after he single-handedly took out 2 enemy positions while wounded. This is General Pienaar pinning the medal to his chest. But in reality, by the morning of the 6th of June 1942, there was little left for the British. The few remaining British battalions still attempting to hold the Cauldron's ring, mostly from the 5th Indian Division, were now attacked one by one and overwhelmed. Only a few subunits managed to get away intact, as the British armour, now all under Messervy's command, tried but were unable to intervene. Neither could the Desert Air Force, which was, once again, hindered by a low-flying cloud and the lack of a bomb line beyond which they could safely engage. Even though the first Hurricane 2D tank destroyer aircraft arrived on this day, only the Axis supply columns were actually attacked. 4th Armoured Brigade found a British major, the sole survivor of the support group of 22nd Armoured Brigade which it was trying to rescue. So now Rommel was definitely in command of the battlefield, and Ritchie couldn't inform Auchinleck of the losses because he didn't yet realise the extent of the disaster. In fact, 30 Corps reported that they had had a successful day. 2nd Armoured Brigade had a very good party yesterday evening, and 22nd Armoured Brigade did very well today. 4th Armoured Brigade seemed to be having a good party. Only the French at Bir Hakeim were really offering decent resistance at this point, and Rommel wanted to take it before attacking the main Gazala positions from the rear. So the Trieste and 90th Light Divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe, were doing their best to take the position, but failed once more. Still out of the picture, Ritchie told Auchinleck he had ordered the 7th Motor Brigade to go around Berhakim and attack the Axis supply lines. At the same time, he had ordered Gott to launch a full-scale attack to the west with the 1st South African Division. But Gott had to talk to Pienaar at 1400 hours, and again at 1700 hours, to try and get him to do something, which even the South African historians have to admit was because Pienaar wasn't playing ball. What's not mentioned by the South Africans is that Pienaar wasn't happy with this plan and refused to cooperate, saying he wasn't going to risk his division attacking a superior force. Gott suggested instead that one brigade be used to raid south, but Pienaar again dismissed this, saying that he didn't have time to prepare one. And so nothing happened on this day. However, it was finally agreed that an attack would go in on the next day. Yes, Pienaar had finally been persuaded to act. It was only at 0700 hours on the 7th of June 1942 that Norrie finally sent a personal signal to Ritchie telling him what had happened 2 days previously. This signal was received at 0940 hours, meaning that, despite some authors saying otherwise, it's not really possible to blame Ritchie for being over-optimistic up until this moment. In addition, shortly after receiving this message, Auchinleck's Chief of Staff, General Thomas Corbett, arrived at Ritchie's headquarters to discuss the situation. Therefore, it's also unfair to conclude that Ritchie was hiding information from Auchinleck, as many historians like to do. It's also worth remembering that General Cunningham was dismissed when he got pessimistic and started advocating a withdrawal during Operation Crusader. Cunningham was replaced by Ritchie, who knew what would happen if he repeated Cunningham's mistakes. So this placed Ritchie in a very delicate position whereby he had to remain optimistic in spite of the facts, and he had to not advocate a withdrawal even though he would soon need to do so. This tricky situation helps explain the subsequent events and could be the reason why Ritchie started to test the waters when it came to a withdrawal. Ritchie knew he would have to withdraw the French from the Berhakim position, since holding it made no sense now as Rommel had opened supply routes through the minefields. But Auchinleck advised against a withdrawal, still thinking of conducting an attack to the west, so Koenig was left to hold on alone. But this could be interpreted as a test from Ritchie to see if he could get away with a small tactical withdrawal without making it seem like he had lost his nerve. If it was, that test had failed because Auchinleck denied it, but perhaps the seed of withdrawal had been planted in Auchinleck's mind. Koenig, though, need not worry because he was about to be saved. You see, on the 7th of June 1942, Pienaar finally attacked. Well, sort of. The 3 company-sized detachments he sent out to scout the terrain ahead and raid Axis positions didn't get very far, and these useless penny packet units suffered the loss of 280 men. Of course, the South African historians don't see it the way that everybody else does. General Pienaar's proposals were perhaps an improvement on the army plan, which apparently required his single division to make an immediate large-scale attack upon 3 others in well-prepared positions, and they were certainly more explicit and less hazardous than those of Corps, but their fatal weakness lay in the size of the forces prescribed. The operation was to be carried out by single companies from each infantry battalion spread over 15 miles of desert in 9 independent attacks, none of which could be supported adequately by artillery fire. While I agree that Ritchie and Gott's initial plans were over-ambitious, Pienaar wasn't facing 3 divisions. He faced 2 weak Italian divisions, which were more the size of regiments, and 1 German brigade. So both sides were probably about equal in numbers, but obviously the Italian infantry weren't the most motivated soldiers in the world, which is why Gott was upset that Pienaar hadn't even tried. General Gott expressed considerable bitterness at General Pienaar's failure and told both British and Dominion officers that he was absolutely convinced that the South African division could have broken through and turned the northern end of the enemy's position. He maintained that Pienaar would not cooperate and made only a half-hearted attempt in order to prove that the task was impossible. Had Gott been given Briggs's Indian Division as originally hoped, plus a brigade of tanks, this could have been a very one-sided fight. As it was, Pienaar was probably correct not to take this too seriously. Still, he did let his own troops down by not adequately planning or supporting his raids, something even the South African historians admit, so it's no wonder most historians take a dim view of Pienaar. Patently, Pienaar was in the wrong job and in the wrong army. He and his division were becoming a liability. Elsewhere on this day, 4th Armoured Brigade, reinforced by 6th Royal Tank Regiment, did try to attack the Germans again, but couldn't get past the 88mm flak and 50mm pack guns. Renton's 7th Motor Brigade managed one last time to get supplies through to the French at Berhakim, but from now on, the French were on their own. On the 8th of June 1942, 7th Motor Brigade and the 4th South African Armoured Cars once again struck into the rear of the Axis forces, destroying numerous trucks, freeing British prisoners and capturing Axis ones. Ritchie also ordered Gott to strike at the Axis supply lines, and this time a mixed British and South African force of tanks, armoured cars and infantry in Bren carriers struck at the Italian-held position at B12. The Italians had no chance, and 25 officers and 340 other men were taken prisoner, showing that, had Pienaar actually taken his attack seriously, he could have done a lot of damage to the Italians at least. By the wiping out of Italian battalions in 10th and 21st Corps, the front was being increasingly thinned out so that penetration by enemy armoured vehicles westwards into the area of our supply lines became very much easier. It's probably because of this threat to the rear, plus the loss of Stukas hitting the French, that caused Kesselring to scream at Rommel, ordering him to bring panzer forces from the north down to Berhakim to finish the job. Rommel was against this idea, thinking that panzers weren't suited to attack a position surrounded by mines, so instead he personally led a strong grenadier force from the 15th Panzer Division south to Berhakim along with the reinforced Hecker Group. Coupled with artillery strikes, the Luftwaffe also launched the heaviest attack so far on the position, which cut the signal lines from König's command to the forward positions. Then the German attacks went in. Infantry from Kleeman's division assaulted the French positions, held by colonial troops from Chad and the Congo. These resisted against attack after attack for several hours and only slowly gave ground. The Desert Air Force finally got their act together and sent out the most sorties in a single day in support of the French, and even attempted to drop supplies for the garrison, although the parachutes didn't open so the supplies got smashed. But several French anti-tank guns were lost, and an ammunition dump was blown up, and ammunition was running low when the fighting stopped that evening. Although French morale remained high, knowing that the eyes of the world were watching them, the French troops were exhausted, and so König asked for reinforcements and relief. Well, the British didn't have strong enough forces on the ground to get through to the French, so Ritchie warned König that he might have to evacuate the position soon. On the 9th of June, Berhakim was hit by air and artillery strikes once more, and the Desert Air Force resumed their former incompetence and mostly didn't take to the skies, citing exhaustion and the belief that the army had everything in hand. This was unfortunate because a Stuka attack then came in and destroyed the remaining reserve stocks of rations. Some British units outside the pocket did harass the enemy to distract them, causing the 90th Light Division to pull forces away to deal with the threat, but otherwise the pressure remained on the French. Rommel had also arrived to oversee the situation, and the Axis managed to push into the pocket, destroying more artillery and anti-tank guns. They broke into the perimeter twice and were thrown back both times. But then the high ground was seized by the Germans, signalling that the battle was entering the final stage. The French had a choice: they could sit there and eventually get destroyed, or they could escape. So that evening, Messervy asked Koenig if he wanted to get out, and Koenig said yes, saying that if transports could get close enough to their position to allow the evacuation of their wounded, the French would make a break for it. But because the transports weren't able to move off immediately, that meant holding on until the next day. Well, on the 10th of June, the RAF were kept at bay by the Axis fighters, as Stukas struck Berhakim once again. More attacks went in and even broke through the French lines, but counterattacks prevented the pocket from collapsing. In the evening, the French had fought almost to the last round, so Ritchie gave Koenig the order to break out that evening. French engineers carved a gap in the minefields to their west, yes, the west, which is actually where the 7th Motor Brigade had managed to get to with a large convoy of lorries in tow. So the Free French left 2 companies behind to make it appear as if they were still there, and made their way through the gap in the mines. Unfortunately, the Germans spotted them, and artillery and machine guns rattled, forcing the French to fight their way out. But they managed to make it to the rendezvous point, where they were driven away, and out of the original 3,600 men, 2,700 men got out, most of them wounded. The guide for the headquarter column missed his way and was blown up 3 times on unexpected minefields, and lived to tell the tale. Among the survivors was an Englishwoman, Susan Travers, who was Koenig's driver and mistress. She was the only woman to become an officer in the Foreign Legion. The defence of Berhakim had been a solid effort on the part of the French, and had caused the Axis numerous problems, especially with supplies. They were forced to abandon it in the end, but this really was a decent victory for the French. Playfair says that by holding the position for as long as they did, the French gave the British an invaluable opportunity to recover from their defeat against Rommel. But Pitt reminds us that Ritchie did nothing with this time except to feed Auchinleck with an over-optimistic assessment of the situation. Yes, they had caught their breath and repaired some tanks, but that was it. Rommel had about the same number of tanks as they did now, although he had lost about a third of his infantry, which was bad, especially since 2 fresh Indian brigades had arrived on the battlefield. Despite reinforcements, things had gotten worse for the British. Gott completely fell out with Pienaar, and while he had managed to form a line between the Gazala minefields and Acroma using some South African infantry, relations had soured. The condition of the 2 remaining armoured brigades was dreadful, and apart from the low tank numbers, the men sensed that the battle was lost. Morale plummeted, especially when the survivors of the previous tank actions were stupidly ordered to take the tanks off the less experienced crews of 1st Armoured Brigade, which resulted in bitter disputes and even more contempt towards the leadership. All the armoured brigades had changed divisions at least twice, which was unsettling and led to administrative difficulties. There was also a huge shortage of artillery, since 7 field regiments had been lost by this point, so the British were definitely on the back foot now. Auchinleck was anxious, fearful of Rommel's next move. Even though he knew the armour was in a dire state, he believed that the British had to keep Rommel engaged in order to prevent him from recovering his own losses. So he hoped that Rommel would attack them, exhaust himself in the process, and give them an opportunity to counterattack by having the 13th Corps strike Rommel in the rear. However, this was fantasy, and both Gott and Norrie started to object against Ritchie's proposals, leading to further breakdown in command and control. The scene was set up for yet another British catastrophe. On the 11th of June 1942, the main British defence line near Gazala still hadn't been cracked open. Yes, Rommel was behind these lines, but the fact that they still manned them shows that Rommel hadn't had it all his own way, and by this point the Axis were in a dire shape too. 15th Panzer Division had started with 3 infantry battalions and was now down to 2 weak ones. They only had 667 men, or 35% of their original infantry. Rommel ordered the 21st Panzer Division to move towards the Sidra Ridge to draw the British into a trap, while the 15th Panzer, Trieste and 90th Light Divisions moved towards El Adam, threatening the British flank. Seeing this, Norrie concluded that the Axis was spread out and could be smashed. He therefore had the 7th Motor Brigade and some Indian columns harass the 90th Light, while the 4th Armoured Brigade moved to the high ground northeast of the 15th Panzer Division to counter it. Thus, on the 12th of June 1942, Norrie wanted Messervy to take the 4th Armoured Brigade and attack the 15th Panzer Division from the west, while the 2nd Armoured Brigade attacked them from the north. As this was happening, Lumsden would command the 22nd Armoured and 32nd Armoured Brigades and hold off the Ariete and 21st Panzer Divisions. This wasn't a bad plan, but the British troops were no longer in the right frame of mind to conduct it, and the British command were also in disagreement with each other. 4th Armoured Brigade belonged to Messervy, and 2nd Armoured Brigade belonged to Lumsden. Lumsden didn't want his brigade in Messervy's hands, and both brigade commanders were also in disagreement with the plan. Richards didn't want to come off the high ground, and Briggs just wanted to go back to Lumsden. So, unable to get them to cooperate, Messervy decided to go see Norrie in hopes that his superior could resolve the dispute. But after leaving his headquarters, he ran into German forces near El Adam, had to hide in a well, and was, once again, out of touch with what was going on. Thus, at the crucial moment, the British just sat there, doing nothing. Well, Messervy had a radio with him, and probably as a last-ditch effort, he ordered the 2 brigades to attack. Unfortunately, this message was intercepted by Rommel, who now knew that the 4th Armoured Brigade was unwilling to come off the high ground. Naring therefore sent the 15th Panzer Division to attack it, which it did reluctantly. The German panzer crews were fatigued by this point, and so the attack was little more than a light probe, which the British resisted easily. But by noon, Norrie had realised that Messervy was missing, and so placed Lumsden in charge of all the tanks. It took time for Lumsden to take over, and so the British had done nothing by 15:30 hours. Lumsden ordered the 22nd Armoured Brigade to move up from the Knightsbridge position, but at the same time, Rommel ordered the 21st Panzer and Italian divisions to move up from the west and attack the 4th Armoured Brigade in support of the 15th Panzer Division. So, at 15:35 hours, both sides started to engage. Because British morale was so poor at this stage, and there was anger and hatred against each other and their superiors, this resulted in a paralysis of command, organisation and willingness to fight. They therefore had no chance when the 21st Panzer Division and the Italians slammed into the rear of 4th Armoured Brigade, destroying 20 tanks in less than 10 minutes. In a short space of time, both the 2nd and 4th Armoured Brigades were surrounded by panzers and hit by the German anti-tank guns. It was a slaughter for about an hour, until the 22nd Armoured Brigade drew off a portion of 21st Panzer Division, opening a gap through which the other brigades could escape. 2nd Armoured Brigade linked up with the 22nd, but the 4th fled further and actually disappeared over the Rommel escarpment with just 15 tanks left. The Knightsbridge area was now a salient in an Axis sea, and having just lost somewhere between 105 and 138 tanks in the space of an afternoon, Lumsden, at least, realised that the British tanks had lost this battle. He only had enough tanks to defend with now, but a communication problem prevented him from talking to Norrie, who was still thinking of taking offensive action. Lumsden was placed under Gott's command, but there were no communications with Gott either, showing just how bad the British command problem was right now. In this instance, Ritchie had done his best to concentrate his armour. It was Messervy, Lumsden and Norrie who somehow messed this all up. But only receiving reports about 24 hours after the events were taking place, Ritchie was totally oblivious to what was happening. So when Auchinleck flew to 8th Army's headquarters to speak to him in person, he found a calm and collected staff who didn't show any indication that a disaster was unfolding at the front. Auchinleck therefore flew back to Cairo to tell London. Atmosphere here good. No undue optimism, and realities of situation are being faced calmly and resolutely. Morale of troops appears excellent. But obviously everything wasn't good and morale had collapsed. This just shows how important open and honest communications are between subordinates and superiors, as well as in general. All efficient forms of organisation require the effective communication of knowledge, and any failure or disruption of that communication results in chaos, which is exactly what was happening for the British. And just to add salt to the wound, that evening the biggest air battle during Gazala occurred, and a whopping 2 German planes were shot down for the loss of 5 British fighters. Clearly, air power wasn't at all decisive in this battle, although Stukas also dive-bombed Rommel and the 15th Panzer Division by mistake, so in some cases it was a hindrance more than a help. On the 13th of June 1942, dust storms prevented most of the planes from taking off, so there was no action in the air on this day either. Rommel's plan now was for the 90th Light Division to engage the Indians at El Adam as a distraction, while the 15th Panzer Division drove over one ridge and the 21st Panzer Division thrust over another to surround the Knightsbridge position. Well, the Germans were exhausted at this point, and the attacks went in reluctantly. Still, the 21st Panzer Division did strike against the British and South African garrison at the Rigel Ridge, which rightfully begged for armour support. 2nd and 4th Armoured Brigades were sent to help, but they couldn't get through the German screens, so the western portion of the ridge was taken by the Germans, and the last of the South African guns on the ridge were destroyed. In the subsequent tank clash, Lieutenant Colonel Foote of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment led repeated charges in his Matilda under a hail of 88mm shell fire. He lost 13 tanks, but won a Victoria Cross for his actions, even though he was captured not long after and didn't learn about his medal until he escaped to Switzerland in 1944. For the first time, the Germans observed British tankers abandoning intact armoured fighting vehicles, Stuart tanks, and surrendering. The battle, which had begun so badly for us, was now taking an increasingly favourable turn. All this we owed to the courage of the German and Italian soldiers. 8th Army was now on the brink of collapse, and still didn't know what was going on, only noting in their diary that both sides had suffered losses. It was obvious that the Knightsbridge position was threatened on both flanks and that the British forces were too weak to resist, so Lumsden asked Gott if he could withdraw the Guards Brigade. Gott said yes, and the 201st Guards Brigade fell back to a Cromer. The garrison of Knightsbridge was withdrawn under the cover of darkness with no more serious casualties than the loss of 1 6-pounder gun, 1 carrier, and a 7-pound tin of Cooper's Oxford marmalade, which a Guards officer, described by his colleagues as temporarily unbalanced in the excitement of his departure, had considered unessential and drained out upon the sand. After the catastrophic loss of the marmalade, and now learning that the British only had 70 tanks left, Ritchie realised that the entire southern flank was on the brink of collapse. This was awkward because Auchinleck had informed London that they were on the back foot, but that they would continue to fight. So, on the morning of the 14th of June, Churchill replied, "Your decision to fight it out to the end is most cordially endorsed. We shall sustain you whatever the result. Retreat would be fatal. This is a business not only of armour but of willpower. God bless you all." Now, this is where there's a major problem with the sources, which has caused massive distortions and debates ever since, so let me just outline the problem. After the battle, Ritchie chose not to defend himself or his actions, and this gave a golden opportunity for everyone else to blame Ritchie for the defeat. And I'm not saying that Ritchie wasn't to blame at all, of course he was, but it's clear that he wasn't the only one at fault. We've already heard how Norrie and Messervy passed the blame onto others, or pretended that they didn't do things when they actually did. And the same thing applies to Auchinleck. Auchinleck allowed Ritchie to take the blame for this battle, which meant that Auchinleck was only at fault for putting Ritchie in charge. Well, one of the narratives that emerged from this was that Ritchie wanted to retreat and wasn't telling Auchinleck what his intentions were. This narrative says that Auchinleck was left in the dark, Ritchie went rogue, and Auchinleck isn't to blame. But Carver, who was a major in this battle but later became a field marshal, wrote a book called Dilemmas of the Desert War, where he showed that Auchinleck did know what Ritchie was up to and exposed other problems with the primary and secondary sources. I could sit here and go through it all, but it would get complicated very quickly and take too long. So just to give one example, Auchinleck's staff officers were visiting Ritchie throughout this period and then flying back to see Auchinleck. And yet, supposedly, not one of them told Auchinleck what was going on or mentioned that Ritchie was disobeying his orders. It is astonishing that, if Ritchie's critics are to be believed, GHQ still had no idea that Gott's 2 divisions had been ordered back to the frontier, when Davie had spent most of the day at Headquarters 8th Army and had, to quote Playfair, the latest information. In addition, the pro-Auchinleck narrative also doesn't make sense because it contradicts the idea that Auchinleck had to hold Ritchie's hand, which is a narrative it also subscribes to. So, Ritchie was indecisive, inexperienced, liked to conduct war councils to gain consensus, showing that he was a timid commander, and Auchinleck was helping him throughout the battle. Yet, all of a sudden, Ritchie miraculously gained the confidence to go rogue and make controversial decisions without anyone's input. And on top of that, nobody at 8th Army's headquarters thought to telephone Auchinleck and warn him about Ritchie, which they had done with Cunningham during Operation Crusader. The staff at 8th Army's headquarters had decided to cut the telephone cables to prevent Cunningham from ordering a withdrawal, and yet none of that happened this time around. And to give another example, according to the pro-Auchinleck sources, when Ritchie told Auchinleck that the 2 divisions on the Gazala line had to retreat, Auchinleck was surprised and disagreed with Ritchie. Apparently he said that the 2 divisions on the Gazala line had to stay where they were. Ritchie then just went against Auchinleck's orders apparently, but if they had stayed where they were, like this narrative wants, these 2 divisions would have been trapped and destroyed. So the narrative makes it out as if Auchinleck didn't want to retreat, which makes zero sense in the circumstances. Had Ritchie followed this narrative's orders, this would have been an even bigger disaster. And of course, there's evidence against the idea that Auchinleck even gave this order, so this pro-Auchinleck narrative just doesn't work. Therefore, while this isn't a certainty and does go against a lot of the books, especially the older ones, I'm going to favour the idea that Auchinleck and Ritchie were on the same page, and that Auchinleck knew what Ritchie was up to. So they both wanted to withdraw, and they were both working together in harmony. Thus, back to the map, since the Axis would probably thrust north, which was what Rommel was planning on doing, Ritchie realised that 2 entire British divisions would be trapped on the Gazala line if they didn't withdraw now. So, in a guarded telephone conversation at 0900 hours on the 14th of June 1942, plus other communications later, Ritchie told Auchinleck that he would have to withdraw the infantry from the Gazala line, and that a withdrawal from these positions couldn't stop at Acroma or Tobruk. They would have to go all the way back to the Egyptian frontier. Auchinleck and Ritchie agreed that these divisions should retreat to the frontier, but until that happened, Auchinleck said that the rest of the forces should hold a line from Alam Hamza to Acroma, and then southeast to El Adam and Bir El Gubi. Ritchie's order to Gott at 10:20 hours said that the 1st South African Division was to retreat via the coast road to Tobruk and beyond. But since the coast road could only support the traffic of a single division, the British 50th Division would have to break out to the southwest through the Italian 10th Corps, at which point they would move south of Bir Hakeim and then head to the frontier. Yes, the 50th Division was instructed to attack through the enemy forces in order to withdraw. An obviously problematic idea. And in order to make things go smoothly, the 50th Division would start its withdrawal at 6 PM in the evening of the 14th, and the South Africans would start their retreat at first light in the morning of the 15th. The reason for the delay was so that the 50th Division could fall back along the coast road if the attack south didn't go well. However, there was a problem.
Pienaar played the diplomatic card throughout the campaign, entirely to his advantage. He did not accept orders and viewed them as no more than the opening position in a debate.
Pienaar didn't like this withdrawal plan and protested it. Why should his division stay put and potentially risk getting surrounded, he asked. Why should his division withdraw in the daylight, whereas the British got to withdraw in the dark? And, in hindsight, Pienaar was correct. As we'll see shortly, a staggered withdrawal was actually bad for the South Africans, and so the plan was changed. Rather than set off one after the other, both divisions would go at the same time, 6 PM on the evening of the 14th, although some rearguards would hold their positions until 9 PM. Throughout the day, Rommel was trying to push north, but was unable to do so because the British had blocked him, and his troops were too exhausted to continue. However, the threat to the coast road was there, so, contrary to the agreed plan, the 1st South African Brigade started moving out of its positions at the Gazala line early in the afternoon, several hours earlier than the agreed time of 6 PM. As they made it down to the coast road, down their allotted pass, they got into a traffic jam and then were hit by Stukas, adding to the chaos. Discipline broke down and the convoy broke apart, with trucks streaming to Tobruk in a panicked flight. Not knowing the full situation, Auchinleck sent Ritchie a message that Ritchie only received at 1600 or 1800 hours, depending on the source. Auchinleck now told Ritchie to hold Tobruk, and to do so, Ritchie should use the infantry withdrawing from the Gazala line to hold the Acroma line. This went against everything they had agreed upon previously, since the original plan was to hold the line from Tobruk to El Adam to Belhamid, not the Acroma line. And by the time Ritchie received Auchinleck's order, Ritchie had already ordered the 2 divisions to withdraw to the frontier. The 1st South African Brigade had already left, and it was far too late to change the orders he had already given. Now, there were genuine communication problems between Ritchie and Auchinleck at this point, and even though it has been argued otherwise, I agree with Carver that it simply wasn't practical to delay the withdrawal to clarify the situation. Even if he could have issued the stop order, and even if Gott could have persuaded Pienaar to not withdraw to the frontier, which is doubtful, the reality is that delaying the withdrawal would have been a disaster, as we'll see shortly. So Ritchie did the right thing to not delay. Ritchie then went to speak to General Gott, but the traditional reason for this meeting seems a bit wishy-washy. Supposedly it was to ask Gott whether he thought Tobruk could hold under siege. But this doesn't make any sense, because Gott wasn't fully informed of the situation, didn't know the condition of the Tobruk defences, and was distracted by his own withdrawal. So why would Ritchie ask Gott about Tobruk? Surely it would have been better to ask the general who was currently holding Tobruk, which was General Klopper of the 2nd South African Division. Pitt speculates that Ritchie didn't inform Gott that Auchinleck wanted the infantry to hold the Acroma line. But I think that was actually the real purpose of this meeting, to see if it was possible for Gott to stop the infantry at that line. Gott probably told Ritchie it was too late for that, his divisions were withdrawing to the frontier. However, Gott supposedly reassured Ritchie, saying that Tobruk could hold, and that the rest of the units should get back to the frontier, regroup, and counterattack to relieve Tobruk again. After speaking to Gott, Ritchie telephoned Cairo hoping to speak with Auchinleck. Unfortunately, he didn't get through to Auchinleck and instead spoke to the Deputy Director of Operations. Ritchie told him that he would do his best, but didn't think that the Acroma to El Adam line was feasible, and he wanted permission from Auchinleck to either abandon Tobruk or be invested in it, if they were forced to retreat to the frontier. And this is important. If you look at what he tells the Deputy Director of Operations, Ritchie is more focused on the Acroma to El Adam line and is only interested in whether Tobruk could hold under siege if that line cannot be held. Coupled with Auchinleck's message later that evening, which we'll see shortly, this supports the idea that Ritchie's conversation with Gott was over where the infantry divisions should stop their withdrawal.
While these discussions were going on, the Germans moved north. 15th Panzer Division was stopped by the garrison at point 187, which was supported by the 22nd Armoured Brigade and various artillery units, and the 21st Panzer Division also came to a halt at Elwet et Tamar. Minefields blocked the way, but once these were cleared in the afternoon, the two Panzer Divisions crashed through the British infantry, who were forced to abandon their heavy equipment in order to escape. Having made a breach, the Germans widened it, and by the end of the day had reached the area east of Commonwealth Keep. They could see the coast road down the escarpment, and in theory they could have gone further, but they were so totally exhausted after 18 days of combat that they physically couldn't. In fact, when the garrison of Commonwealth Keep retreated, some elements went down the escarpment, but others went straight towards the Acroma line above the escarpment. Well, they actually drove right past a bunch of sleeping Germans on their way and managed to get to safety. It was fortunate that the Germans were so exhausted because the two other South African brigades and the 50th Division now began their withdrawal as well. Rearguards stayed behind to shield the retreat, led by Brigadier de Troyes, and at first all seemed to be going smoothly. The 50th Division successfully burst through the Italian lines to the south, and after a long trek where they shed off a lot of equipment, the men made it to safety, although the division could no longer be considered battle-worthy. The exception for this breakout was Lieutenant Colonel Percy's 9th Battalion plus other elements, which failed to get through because the Italians had finally woken up and blocked their path. So instead, Percy joined the 1st South African Division in their withdrawal to the north.
Just before midnight, Auchinleck sent Ritchie a message that wasn't deciphered until the afternoon of the next day due to genuine communication issues. This message told Ritchie that no portion of the 8th Army was to be surrounded in Tobruk. It said that the 8th Army was to remain a mobile army, and the Acroma line was to be held.
Our forces will not be invested in Tobruk, and your army is to remain a mobile field army.
Not hearing about this until the next day, Ritchie told Auchinleck that he didn't like the idea of holding the Acroma line, explaining it would stretch his forces too thin, and they would be isolated and cut off. What's important about this particular message is that Ritchie mentions he spoke with Auchinleck's staff officer who had been with him recently. This proves that Auchinleck knew exactly what Ritchie was doing, and that he must have been in agreement with him about the withdrawal.
Somehow Churchill got wind that the British were withdrawing to the frontier, so he asked Auchinleck, "To what position does Ritchie want to withdraw the Gazala troops? Presume there is no question in any case of giving up Tobruk. As long as Tobruk is held, no serious enemy advance into Egypt is possible. We went through all this in April 1941. Do not understand what you mean by withdrawing to Old Frontier. Chief of the General Staff agrees with all this."
Every time Churchill intervened, things got worse, and Churchill was intervening again. So, as usual, catastrophe would soon follow.
This signal contradicting policy long agreed marks the true cause and beginning of the resounding disaster of Tobruk.
In the morning of the 15th of June 1942, Auchinleck replied to Churchill, stating that he would hold the Acroma to El Gubi area and that it wouldn't be a fortified line as such, but he would prevent the Axis from moving east of it.
Although I do not intend that 8th Army should be besieged in Tobruk, I have no intention whatever of giving up Tobruk.
Just to point out, Auchinleck did say in this message that the two divisions from Gazala would help hold the Acroma line. However, that does not mean that there was some sort of disagreement between Ritchie and Auchinleck over where these divisions should withdraw to. At this point, Auchinleck most likely thought that he had time to withdraw them to the frontier, reconstitute, and then send them back to hold the line before Rommel smashed the other forces. Considering that Auchinleck would congratulate Ritchie the next day, which he wouldn't do if he had disobeyed his orders, we know that this is the correct interpretation of this message.
Anyway, in the early hours of the 15th of June 1942, 1st South African Division's vehicles were racing down the coast road in a giant mess, getting shelled by the panzer divisions. After Detroit's headquarters made it to safety, a battalion of German infantry and 6 Panzer Mark IIIs moved onto the coast road, cutting off the rear guards. Percy and his battalion, plus some South Africans, managed to fight their way through the German screen, destroying most of the German tanks in the process. But the majority of the South African rearguards were leaderless, and so were quickly captured.
It's worth highlighting the fact that Ritchie had made the right decision. If he hadn't ordered Gott to pull out when he did, Rommel would have cut off the 1st South African Division in the west. There's a chance Pienaar could have escaped south like the 50th Division did, but that probably would have resulted in his division losing its heavy equipment, so this was still a good decision. Equally, Pienaar had also been right to reject his initial orders and insist that his division escape earlier than instructed. Yes, the retreat was chaotic and he did lose some units and took casualties, but the vast majority of his division got out. Had they delayed any longer, they would have had to fight their way out, which they may have been able to do, but in the chaos of the retreat, this would have been difficult. So overall, in regards to making the initial decision and then timing this retreat, Ritchie and Pienaar were correct. However, Rommel himself makes an incredibly good point. The 1st South African Division would have been better going south with the British 50th Division, since not only would all of it have escaped, but it could have done significant damage to Rommel's rear areas, which is what the 50th Division had done. Also, by going south, the British wouldn't have needed to form a line from point 160 to Acroma and get their armour, infantry and artillery destroyed in piecemeal penny packets yet again. The reason Pienaar didn't go south was because Pienaar had been reluctant to do so in the previous weeks. So while Pienaar was correct to insist on withdrawing when he did, his overall reluctance to engage the Axis or cooperate with the British command was a detriment to the Allied cause. But surprisingly, von Mellenthin suggests that Rommel had also made a mistake here. He says he should have used all the mobile units, including the Italians, in his thrust north to cut the coast road, and he's surprised he didn't do that. It looks like he had to cover his rear though, which is why he didn't do it. I'm also going to point out that there may have been a better option for Rommel, assuming his logistics could have done it. Instead of going straight north to cut the coast road west of Tobruk, maybe Rommel could have raced east and cut the coast road off on the other side of Tobruk instead. He was about to do this anyway, and the only question is, could he have done it now? I'm not saying this definitely was a mistake or that this was definitely a viable option, I don't know for sure, but it's something to consider. Anyway, when he found out that his 2 divisions had gone to sleep just short of the coast road and had let the enemy get away, Rommel raged at his subordinates. After the outburst though, he composed himself and then issued further instructions.
15th Panzer Division guarded the Acroma area, while the 21st Panzer Division moved south to Knightsbridge, with instructions to go for El Duda after that. The 90th Light Division was sent to El Adam again, where it mounted 3 attacks that failed in the face of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade. And the 21st Panzer Division was stopped as well by 1 Indian battalion, who managed to knock out several panzers with their 2-pounders. At 1930 hours, as Norrie told Ritchie that he thought that he could hold El Adam, the 115th Motorised Infantry Regiment, plus some panzers, reinforced the 21st Panzer Division and overwhelmed the lone Indian battalion. 700 Indians, most of them wounded, surrendered, opening the road to the east.
Overall, Rommel was pleased, writing a letter to his wife saying that the battle had been won and that the British were breaking up. This wasn't entirely true, the British infantry were largely intact, but it's true that the battle had been won. The way was now open for Rommel to surround Tobruk, and it was just a matter of time now. On the British side, Lieutenant General Corbett, Auchinleck's Chief of Staff, was ordered to visit Ritchie's headquarters and discover what Ritchie was up to. This was the same guy who had been a couple of days previously, but for some reason fails to mention this. Supposedly, Ritchie and Corbett got into a heated argument because Ritchie wasn't following Auchinleck's orders.
"We thumped the desk and shouted at each other. It was most unpleasant."
The problem with this is that Ritchie replied to Auchinleck just before midnight saying that the two Gazala divisions were falling back to the frontier, and said that Auchinleck's line was being held by several units, contradicting Corbett's account. Again, Auchinleck also told Ritchie, "Well done," the next day in reply to this, even though he was supposedly told by Corbett that Ritchie was disobeying him. So, no. Corbett's thumping desk idea is suspect, and Auchinleck was fully in agreement with Ritchie.
On the 16th of June 1942, the Italians and the 15th Panzer Division captured 6,000 British prisoners as they fell back towards Tobruk. Entire convoys of undamaged trucks fell into German hands, while many other vehicles were left to burn. And with the Italians arriving, the 15th Panzer Division was able to start its move towards Tobruk, as Rommel urged the other divisions to keep pushing east. The 21st Panzer Division took El Duda at noon, then, avoiding most of the 20th Indian Infantry Brigade, they went south to Sidi Rezai. Supported at first by nearby Jock columns from 4th Armoured Brigade, the 1st Battalion of the 6th Rajputana Rifles resisted until their artillery ammunition ran out and the tanks retreated to replenish, at which point the Indians were overwhelmed and captured.
Knowing that repairs were being conducted, Ritchie still hoped he could get his armoured formations back in action soon for a possible counterattack. Until this happened, he ordered the creation of Jock columns of mixed artillery, tank and infantry formations to stab at the enemy as much as possible. These weren't strong enough to make a significant impact, but at least they were doing something. Ritchie's intention at this stage was to hold El Adam, and he made this clear to Norrie and Messervy in the afternoon. Ritchie stressed the importance of holding El Adam, but told Norrie that if the local situation dictated it, then El Adam could be abandoned. But Norrie was now saying that he didn't have enough armour to defend El Adam or Belhamed. Norrie spoke to Messervy, who said a complete withdrawal to the frontier was now necessary. Reid, commander of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, wanted to hold for another 24 hours, but after speaking to Messervy, Reid evacuated El Adam at midnight. The Desert Air Force was not informed about this retreat until the next day, and its airfields near Gambut were protected only by the positions at Belhamed. Had Belhamed fallen, or had the Axis raided further, Gambut and the Desert Air Force could have been overrun.
As the British aircraft shuttled to and fro, the rearming and refuelling parties could hear the burst of their own bombs falling among the enemy's foremost troops.
The reason they weren't informed was because neither was the 8th Army headquarters, which also reported at midnight that El Adam was still being held. In fact, Ritchie wouldn't find out about this withdrawal until the afternoon of the next day. Meanwhile, Auchinleck replied to Churchill's previous query saying that Ritchie was putting a garrison in Tobruk to hold it, which should only be temporary, since the El Adam area would be the jumping off point for relief of Tobruk.
Thus, Churchill had his wish, and paved the way for one of the greatest single disasters ever suffered by the British in the Middle East and Mediterranean in the Second World War. He later attempted to shift the blame from himself to Auchinleck with a disingenuousness only qualified by the weakness of his argument.
Churchill basically said he thought the defences at Tobruk had been maintained, and that he didn't know that Auchinleck and Ritchie were thinking of abandoning Tobruk before this point. But this is nonsense. Everyone on the British side, including Churchill, had previously agreed that Tobruk would not be held. In fact, Auchinleck had informed Churchill of this point on the 19th of January 1942, so why would Churchill state the opposite or assume that the defences were maintained? It's because it's just an excuse. Churchill had changed his mind at the last moment, and the commanders in the field were left to hodgepodge some sort of defence. And again, Churchill had intervened and made the situation worse. With Auchinleck's instructions, Ritchie decided that the 2nd South African Division would remain in Tobruk, that a siege would be accepted, and that the port facilities and the stores of goods that were there would not be destroyed. South African General Klopper would be in charge, and he was optimistic about the situation and believed he could hold the port. Meanwhile, most of the stores from the British main base at Belhamed had been removed, except for 1 million rations and 1.5 million gallons of petrol. Ritchie ordered that the petrol be poured into the sand, and so that night the men of the base half-poisoned themselves from the fumes and rotted their boots in order to get rid of the petrol. Due to repairs and replacements, on the 17th of June 1942, the 4th Armoured Brigade had managed to gather 90 tanks for a counterattack, many of which still had holes in them. With these holy tanks, Messervy ordered Richards to move to the area between Sidi Rezai and El Adam in order to attack the Germans near Belhamed in the flank. Richards wasn't happy because the terrain in this area was unsuitable. And in fact, the previous commander of the brigade, Gatehouse, had also not wanted to move through this terrain during Operation Crusader for the exact same reason. Nonetheless, obeying their orders, 4th Armoured Brigade started moving towards Sidi Rezai, thinking that the area was still in British hands. It wasn't. The 21st Panzer Division set up a tank and anti-tank screen as the 5th Panzer Regiment from 15th Panzer Division moved off to their right wing. That afternoon, as the sun blinded them to what was ahead, the British rolled straight into the better part of 2 Panzer Divisions. Worse, they were split into 3 groups, and went in piecemeal yet again, for reasons that aren't clear. Most of their artillery had been dispersed into jock columns, leaving the British tanks to fight, as usual, without any crucial support. The few artillery guns that had remained with the tanks packed up and left the tanks to it, giving them a taste of their own medicine for all the times the tanks had previously abandoned the infantry and artillery. As you can imagine, this then ended up being a very one-sided fight, and after this beating, Richards withdrew south to a field maintenance centre, and the Germans disengaged. 2 British armoured divisions had been reduced to 1 brigade, which now had just 58 tanks in it. Another 32 were either left burning on the battlefield, were damaged, or had broken down, which is why Richards went to the field maintenance centre. Regardless, as Pitt says, 30 Corps had ceased to exist. And it was, apparently, for this particular action, which would lead to General Messervy getting sacked.
It was the first in a series of sackings that would shake the 8th Army over the next few weeks.
The Panzers now raced north that evening and were between the Indians and the airfield at Belhamed, which was still being used by the Desert Air Force. With nothing to protect them, Air Marshal Conyngham ordered the evacuation of Gambut, and most aircraft seemed to have gotten away, but 15 operational aircraft plus a load of supplies of oil and petrol fell into German hands. Norrie ordered the 20th Indian Brigade to fall back from Belhamed, and they started moving northeast towards the coast road. The South African historians point out that, had they instead retreated into Tobruk, they would have found the road clear and could have helped the garrison there. But they didn't, they retreated east. Well, overnight into the 18th of June, the Germans drove north, and the 21st Panzer Division reached the coast road just after midnight, and the coast itself just before 1 AM. The 2 remaining battalions of 20th Indian Infantry Brigade retreated straight into the 5th Panzer Regiment a couple of hours later, and were captured. The brigade was no more, with only their artillery and some of the survivors managing to get out. Rommel had captured huge quantities of supplies, including tons of Axis ammunition, which had remained in the places they had abandoned them during Operation Crusader. Tobruk was now surrounded for a 3rd time, once during Operation Compass, second after Rommel's first offensive in the desert, and finally now as well. With a disaster unfolding before them, Auchinleck flew to see Ritchie on the 18th. Gott was placed in command of all the forces at the front except for Tobruk, which was given its own command under the 8th Army, and it was decided that 30 Corps headquarters was to be pulled out of the line to Matra for reserve and training tasks. 4th Armoured Brigade spent this day and the next, the 19th, reorganising and repairing before falling back to the frontier. While most of the 1st South African, British 50th and 10th Indian Divisions would fall back to the frontier, Auchinleck also dictated that 2 brigades from each would try to help Tobruk and prevent Rommel from reaching the Egyptian frontier, proving what we said earlier about these divisions reconstituting before being put back into the line. However, it does show that the British had little left with which to relieve Tobruk, and it would effectively signal the end of the Battle of Gazala, although they didn't realise it at the time. Rommel wanted to attack Tobruk immediately to not give the British time to organise an effective defence or relief operation. Kesselring also wanted Tobruk dealt with so he could turn his Luftwaffe on Malta, and the Italians were just as eager as well. Thus, on the 18th of June 1942, Rommel issued the orders for the attack on Tobruk, which would begin on the 20th of June. We'll hear about that attack in the near future. The Battle of Gazala featured one of the most concentrated tank battles in history. In late May 1942, 1,500 tanks battled it out in the area south of Knightsbridge. But despite having several advantages, Rommel's initial flanking attack was not as well executed as hoped, and incurred horrendous losses.
The 90th Light Division only had 1,000 combat troops left by the end of the battle, and its other 2 panzer divisions had something similar because the Afrika Korps only had 2,500 infantry left after Tobruk. Only 44 panzers and 14 Italian tanks remained out of the original 560 Axis tanks, while the Ariete and Trieste divisions had about 2,500 infantry left as well. In other words, Rommel had actually lost the majority of his tanks and a lot of his infantry in this battle, as well as Tobruk. Unter Nearmontius was the kind of operation that clearly should have begun with shaping attacks against some of the more exposed positions to better understand the British defences and make it more difficult for Ritchie to assess where the main blow was falling. Yet, Rommel was unwilling to consider a more methodical approach to battle and refused even to maintain any mobile reserves.
Rommel's plan had been superficial. In a lot of ways, it should have failed. Had the British had their act together, it probably would have failed. Yes, Rommel led from the front, allowing him to decisively influence the battle, unlike the British commanders who were miles behind the front and were out of touch half the time, but Rommel had thrown away a victory during Operation Crusader and had nearly lost this battle too. He had certainly lost the majority of his tanks, and there was a great degree of recklessness in Rommel's style of command. So really, Gazala wasn't won by Rommel's genius, it was lost by British incompetence. This is meant to be Rommel's best battle. It's the battle that defined him. And you can find accounts saying that Gazala was Rommel's most impressive victory in North Africa. But at best, it was a Pyrrhic victory. If you think about it, Rommel's not that great a commander. He was decisive, but he also made mistakes, and his plans were often flawed. The reason Rommel did so well wasn't so much because he was a genius, it was because the British sucked. And by developing the Rommel myth, the British could excuse their own incompetence by saying Rommel was this amazing commander, when he really wasn't. Maybe he wasn't a terrible commander, but he was nothing special.
Post Tobruk, the British had lost 33,000 of their original 100,000 men, 2,000 vehicles, and 6,400 tons of supplies. The exact number of tanks lost by the British is hard to say because some were repaired and sent back into action, but of the 573 cruiser tanks they originally had, plus the 145 from 1st Armoured Brigade that arrived during the battle, plus more sent from Egypt, they were left with about 58 on the 18th of June. And of the original 276 infantry tanks, they were left with 20 on the 14th of June, and probably most of these ended up in Tobruk where they were subsequently lost. So the British lost at least 936 tanks in total, but probably more than that.
Despite these losses, it's true that the new Grant tanks had performed a lot better than the other British tanks and had done a lot of damage to Rommel's panzers, even if they all got took out. The 6-pounder anti-tank guns had also done their job well, certainly better than the 2-pounders. Okay, there weren't enough of these new guns or tanks, But if the British had employed them properly, this battle could have ended so differently.
1 Grant had been hit no fewer than 31 times, with the only damage being caused by 2 50mm hits on the front visors and a rear hit by a 37mm. Another had been hit 12 times with no penetrations.
The main problem was that the armour as a whole just didn't perform well at all. They didn't cooperate with the infantry or artillery and didn't cooperate with themselves. The armoured brigades and battalions continued to fight separately, leading to them getting destroyed piecemeal on numerous occasions, even to the exasperation of Rommel. And the reason why it didn't perform well was because of bad leadership.
The proximate cause of the 8th Army's misuse of its armoured assets was ineffectual leadership from the top, Auchinleck-Ritchie, down to the corps commanders Gott, Norrie, and divisional commanders Messervy, Lumsden. None of these men had any deep experience or understanding of armoured operations, or even how to properly organise a combined arms operation involving 2 or more brigades.
The 7th Motor and 3rd Indian Brigades were meant to have been the infantry element of the 7th Armoured Division, yet were scattered about the desert and generally didn't cooperate with the tanks. And the motorised brigade of the 1st Armoured Division, the 201st Guards Brigade, sat in the Knightsbridge area for most of the battle, not being used in cooperation with the tanks, and this was because their leaders didn't know what they were doing. Messervy was just terrible. He spent more time running, hiding or being captured than he did leading his troops. And while Messervy gets a lot of the criticism from the books, really Lumsden must take a decent share of the blame too. He just wasn't an effective commander, uncooperative, and was unwilling to commit his tanks when they were needed. When he did send in his tanks, they went in feebly and haphazardly, such as against the Italians on Asla Ridge on the 30th of May. Lumsden seemed more concerned about retaining his command and not cooperating with Messervy than fighting the battle, and both Messervy and Lumsden plus Norrie all ignored the signs that Rommel was advancing around Bir Hakeim because they thought they knew better than Ritchie.
Before Operation Aberdeen, the British armour had basked in the glow of Wavell's campaign, and Operation Crusader, despite its many setbacks, had been a success. But after Operation Aberdeen, the reputation of the armour sank from one low point to the next until Montgomery changed everything at Alam Halfa.
Again, we can see how important Montgomery was going to be. And I think part of the reason the British armoured organisation was so bad was because the British armoured units, including the 1st Armoured Division, had their origins in the cavalry tradition. Horses, an outdated form of warfare, were not the same as tanks, yet the attitudes and ideas of the cavalry had stuck around far longer than they should have done. This wasn't the 17th, 18th or even 19th century, this was the 20th century, and yet the British armour was roaming about the battle in the same way the cavalry had at Waterloo. And at Waterloo, the cavalry and infantry also didn't cooperate, which is why the cavalry got destroyed there too.
At Gazala, they sealed up their troops in or behind the minefield in a series of isolated forts or boxes. These boxes faced 4 square, ready to meet attack from any direction. It was the old idea of the British square at Waterloo, adapted to modern fast armoured fighting.
Even the idea of having a split between cruiser, i.e. cavalry, and infantry tanks doesn't make any sense, and really is a remnant of this old cavalry tradition. Because they saw themselves as cavalrymen in tank form, they didn't want to cooperate with the infantry or artillery, and so they didn't, and that's why they got destroyed.
The principal aim of the British should have been to have brought all the armour they had into action at one and the same time. They should never have allowed themselves to be duped into dividing their forces before the battle. Mobile warfare in the desert has often and rightly been compared with a battle at sea, where it is equally wrong to attack piecemeal and leave half the fleet in port during the battle. The British failure was due purely and simply to the inability of their command to concentrate and coordinate the armoured and motorised brigades. And just to add to this, the Desert Air Force also performed poorly. It was difficult for the Desert Air Force to aid 8th Army with direct support because of the fluid and confused nature of the fighting. Its contribution to the action was more the bombing of supply lines and the chasing away of enemy aircraft.
Ritchie, however, has traditionally taken most of the blame for the defeat at Gazala, and he certainly should take some of it. Amongst numerous criticisms, perhaps the biggest were that he lacked experience, shouldn't have been made an army commander in the first place, and his planned counterattacks were a disaster, although certainly not entirely his fault. Auchinleck kept Ritchie in place because it would have been awkward to have replaced him after the Crusader victory, so Auchinleck does take blame for that. But Ritchie can be blamed for not willingly stepping down prior to the Battle of Gazala. If he had stepped aside, maybe a more competent commander like Montgomery could have taken over, which is why he didn't step down, because Auchinleck wouldn't have wanted that. Auchinleck is also at fault for insisting that Rommel's main attack would be against the Gazala line, not around the south. The consequence was that the commanders dismissed the reports showing Rommel's tanks were in the south, were reluctant to commit their armoured brigades into action, and ultimately resulted in the piecemeal annihilation of the British units. While it's possible to just pin the blame on Ritchie, and many have, in reality Auchinleck's mistakes placed Ritchie in a terrible position and undermined his authority. The subordinate commanders also made huge mistakes, again thanks to Auchinleck's input, but also their own incompetence, so it is wrong to just blame Ritchie and let Auchinleck off the hook. Gazala would cast a long shadow over the North African campaign. It led to the fall of Tobruk, the British retreat to El Alamein, the battles that took place there, numerous sackings, Montgomery, and the cautiousness that the British were later known for. We'll be covering all these battles and more in the future, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And check out these other videos here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.